You all would give me your attention, I would appreciate it. Thank you so much. Uh, I asked a friend of mine, a colleague, the Reverend Julia Bruton Shepherd, if she would provide for us a time of meditation. It's our practice with the missiological conversations that we ground ourselves in, uh, remember whose we are and where we are and who we serve and why we do the things we do in the name of Christ. Julie's a spiritual director and has been very instrumental in my life with regard to helping me to address those kinds of issues. And with that said, I'm going to ask my friend if she will come up now and help us to center ourselves as we begin our day.
Good morning. And all who are online, good morning to you out there as well. It is written in the 17th chapter of the book of Acts, starting at the 26th verse. I'd like to present you with this thought. From one ancestor, he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth. And he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each of us. For in him we live and move and have our very being. With that in mind, I'd like you to just position yourselves, feet flat on the floor. Out there, those who are watching online, please find a comfortable position, sitting upright. And if you can, if you're comfortable, I'm going to ask that you close your eyes. Only if you're comfortable, or just gaze out at something that's beautiful. We have some trees. The sun is starting to come out. You can even see it through the shade. Perhaps that's the direction of your focus, but if you can close your eyes, that will be wonderful as well. And I'm going to ask that you pay attention to your breath. In him we live and move and have our very being. Breathing in and breathing out. Breathing in and breathing out. Breathing in and breathing out. Continue, of course. Breathe in and breathe out. And if you can take in one, at my guide, at my lead, I want you to take in one very deep breath. You're going to hold it a couple seconds, and then you're going to exhale, pushing it out from your tummy, exhaling longer than your inhale. All right, let's get ready. Breathe in. In. When you think you can't hold anymore, take one little sip and hold it. And exhale. Let it go, let it go. Push it out. Push it all out. Pay attention to how that feels. Let's do it again. Breathe in. Far as you can. Take a sip, hold it. And let it go. Push it out. All of it, all of it. And we're going to do it one more time for the Holy Spirit. Breathe in. Take one more sip, hold it. And exhale. Let it go. Let it go, let it go. Now pay attention to how your body feels. Notice it. And there may be times when you need to take these breaths until you feel a difference. Before you go into a meeting, before you knock on a door, before you get out of your car, before you get into your car. You can take these breaths standing as well. But there's something else I want you to know, and that is this. When we inhale, we are breathing in oxygen. We all know that. But that oxygen comes from plants, the trees around us. And then when we exhale carbon dioxide and give it back to the trees, who takes on the carbon and gives off the oxide, and there's made oxygen, and it's a continuous cycle. So when you take a breath, consider that you are breathing the oxygen from the Amazon. And at certain times a year, it's crossing the Atlantic from Africa. But it's a continuous cycle, breathing in and breathing out. We are created to be dependent, codependent, interdependent is a better word, interdependent on all creation. Think about that. Now, the next thing I want you to do is find your heartbeat. You can put your hand on your neck, on your chest, wherever you'll feel it. I'm going to give you a chance to feel that rhythm. As you're breathing in and breathing out, still feel your heart. Your heart began to beat within 4 weeks of the time of your conception. Probably before your mother knew she was carrying you, your heart was beating. And it has continued to this day, faithfully beating. Most of the time without your thinking about it. It beats. Pumping life-giving, oxygen-rich blood to every cell in our bodies. Continue to beat. Faithfully. And I'd like you to consider that the beating of our heart is a manifestation and representation of God's faithfulness to us. When we're not even thinking about it, God is faithful to us. When we take for granted the beats, God is faithful to us, allowing us to take God for granted too. And anytime you feel distant from God, take in a deep breath. Anytime you feel God is not as close as you'd like, pay attention to your heart, the beat. God is just that close, faithfully keeping you alive. Let us pray. Heavenly Father and our Mother too, our divine parent, we thank you for the life of this day as we breathe you in and breathe you out and feel the blood coursing through our bodies as our heart beats. We are confident as we have gathered this day, hearts united for conversation, for so many of the social needs, the economic needs, the theological needs, the spiritual needs of our church and community. And just as you are faithful, represented in the beating of our hearts, we count on you to be faithful in the conversation. The spirit of wisdom moving and discernment and cooperation as we speak and as we listen. We thank you for this time of preparation and look forward to all the ways you will reveal yourself to us this day. In the name of Jesus, we pray. And all our souls say, amen.
We'd like to welcome you, both those in the room and those who are joining with us online. We'd like to welcome you to the 2024 Missiological Conversation of the Philadelphia Baptist Association. We're a mission organization, and it's imperative that we take time regularly to think about who we are, who we're charged to be, and what we're trying to do in the world. So the topics change from year to year. In the past, we've dealt with various topics, and I'm delighted to be here today with you. This day is about you and the work that you will do when you leave this place as clergy who are charged to be with and to be supportive of people as they go through this or participate in this political climate. The needs are varied, and we need to be clear about what we're doing, the skills that we use, the ways that we help, because this is a confusing time, and some folks would rather shut their minds off and act like the world is not in disarray, or there's not significant challenge going on right now. But as those called to be light and called to be salt, what impact will we have, and how intentional are we about it? So with those comments, I just will say welcome to you. Thank you for coming, and we appreciate your participation today. I want to invite Reverend Kerwin Webb to come and say greetings on behalf of American Baptist on Mission Society.
Good morning. And welcome home. On behalf of our Executive Director, Dr. Jeffrey Haggray, in his absence, we welcome you to the Leadership and Mission Building here at ABHMS. We view our work as equipping and working with partner organizations and agencies in the work of transformation, in the work of healing, in the work of justice. And so this 2024 Missiological Conversation fits right in alignment with that. So we are grateful that you are here to engage in this all-important topic. And so we hope that you will take it all in. We hope that what is shared here will inform your work once you leave here. And we also hope that we can look forward to partnering with you into the future as this year and the future years come. If there is anything that you need while you are here, please see me, Kerwin Webb, or I have some colleagues here with me, Reverend Saeed Richardson. How did I lose his last name? Wow. Dr. Marie O, who's over in the corner. Have Dr. Shante Barrett, who's back there. Peter Bickle, who's on the camera. Miss Mary Ann Walker, who's back there. Ask any of us, and we can direct you to where you need to be. The restrooms, when you came in, if you were past the reception desk down the hall to the right, there are signs that's directing you to them. But if you need help, please just ask. But I'm going to get out of your way because we are eager to hear from the presenters, the speakers, and we're eager to engage in the breakout room. So I look forward to engaging with you. And again, welcome home.
I think I'll turn on the microphone. Can you hear me now? Here it is. So I think I'll do some introductory remarks and process discussion, and then I'll invite the panelists to come up and we'll get underway. Okay, so theme, Christian belief, white supremacy, authoritarian governments equals fascism. Anytime we talk about fascism, people want to shut down. We don't want to talk about that. It's an issue that, or a topic that causes people to want to retreat. As we were struggling to name what we would do, every time I introduced the topic in the various groups around American Baptist Churches USA, I got pushback on the word fascism. Oh, do you have to use that word? That's going to make everybody not come. They're not going to come and talk about that. That was the experience that I had. So that made me say, well, let's just spell it out what it is. Let's name it. And let's talk about it because it's the reality in which we find ourselves, and we'll unpack that in a little bit. So, in general, the process for today, the two panel discussions. The first one, we're going to unpack issues around fascism, the church, its role, and all that. The panelists will speak. Each will do a presentation, and then we'll have some talk back between them. Then there's communication, there's talk back from you all. We will, you all can ask questions of the speaker. We have a process by which those who are online can get questions, and those questions will also come to the speaker. Okay? Then, once we finish with the talk back, you all break into small groups as practitioners and bring your expertise to bear on the subject matter. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? How do we process this? How do we use it? Because the bottom line is, we're here because we want you to be able to say, this is the political climate that I'm in. This is what my people are facing. And this is how I'm preparing myself to minister to them in this season. That's the bottom line. Your ministry is the bottom line for us. Okay? So, missiological conversation, we always make sure that the clergy participants have plenty of time to talk about whatever the issue is among themselves, and also to share with each other the perspectives that you bring, the expertise that you bring. So that's the process. That's what we're talking about. And now I'd like to ask our presenters who come to share with us today, if they would come forward. This program book, you have it, and those of you who are online also have it. It's understood to be a resource as well as a guide for today. And there's definitions of fascism and fascist tactics, that kind of information that you can use later. And there's also a resource material that's prepared for you. We'll talk about that a little bit later today. One of our presenters is the Reverend Dr. Willie D. Francois III. And I hope I said that right. He's the senior pastor of Fountain Baptist Church in Summit, New Jersey, and president of the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality, a national think tank and policy advocate organization. He's New York Theological Seminary, director of the Masters of Professional Studies program at Sing Sing and Bedford Hills Correctional Facilities, and associate professor. You can read the rest of the information there on the bio page. Dr. Kirsten Kim is the Paul E. Pearson Professor of World Christianity at Fuller Theological Seminary, where she serves as Associate Dean for the Center for Missiological Research. Having a missiological conversation, I was delighted to be able to invite someone who spends their time thinking about missiology and helping us to get our heads around that whole topic. I don't know about you, but I didn't, I digress, but here we go. When I was in seminary, I don't remember taking a course entitled Missiology. That didn't mean they didn't teach us something related to the topic. It just, what I'm trying to say was, way back when I was in seminary, I don't know that we were as intentional about talking about the mission of the church, who we are, where we've gone, what we practice, what we're doing, as I would like to have seen at the school that I went to, and they shall remain nameless now that I've dogged them out. Okay? But, so that's my way of saying welcome, and thank you for your time and your willingness to come and share with us. So with all that said, we're going to get underway. We'll start with the first discussion. And pardon me as I flip through this book. I'm going to ask Willie if he'll start. And the first topic, what are believers struggling to process in this political climate? What assistance do they need from clergy? You see that there's a lot of little sub-questions under there. She's going to address some of them. But that gives you a sense of where they're going, okay? So it helps you to follow the logic of where we're going. It's enough of me. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for convening us. And good morning, everyone. Good morning. So today I want to spend my few moments not necessarily answering the questions, but using them as a springboard for talking about what I think is quite pressing as we consider this political moment. I often find myself saying every election cycle that this is the most important election of my lifetime. Since I have been voting, I've only been eligible to vote since Barack Hussein Obama's first presidency. But every election, I've seemingly said those same words. This is the most important election of my lifetime. And one of the reasons I feel that is important to say is James Baldwin says that words like freedom, justice, and democracy are not common concepts. On the contrary, we are not born knowing what those words mean. For me, that raises the question of, well, where do we learn how to practice democracy? Where are the spaces, where are the institutions that teach us what it means to be small d Democrats, those who are practitioners in the very government that is supposed to protect us and meet out and participate in the meeting of our needs? Where are those spaces that we learn how to be democratic? And incubators of revolution and resistance. But this question of freedom, justice, and democracy, reminding ourselves that they are not natural to who we are. They are not innate in how we show up in the world. These are some assumptions that I'm putting out there that we can fully disagree with. And possibly that's why Ronald Niebuhr makes the case that our capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but our inclination for injustice makes democracy necessary. Drawing this contrast between democracy and fascism. And how I want to continue the rest of my thoughts is not necessarily thinking about the fascists, right? Because it is easier for us to think about the leader, the demagogue, who becomes the face, who drives fascism. It's easy for us to even think about this type of system of government that breaks and denies and fragments who we are as people. But I really, as I think more and more about the failures of democracy, and I think more and more about the rise of authoritarianism and totalitarianism and fascism, right? And I know there are ways that we distinguish those, but they are all antithetical to what it means to live out the image of God in the world, in my opinion. I am drawn more in this political cycle of thinking about what traumatizes us into accepting fascism. Because it has been too easy for me to turn MAGA people into enemies. It's been too easy for me to make claims about folk who are part of that cult, as I understand it, without actually slowing down enough to raise questions about what makes persons susceptible to that type of thinking. We are talking about people who love their children. We're talking about people who love a version of Jesus, even if they don't follow that Jesus. We are talking about people who, in probably most accounts, are not hateful people. They probably have black friends. They probably have queer persons who are part of their larger orbit, even if they have theological positions that suggest that they are doomed for hell. They probably have love for persons who do not identify in a type of through their sexual identities in ways that they do. This question is, what makes persons susceptible to fascism and authoritarianism? And I have been wrestling more and more with the concept of how a nation and how a capitalist economy traumatizes us into looking for solutions and answers that belie our very nature, that belie how we engage in the world. There are two ways that I want to think about this, because there is the complicity with fascism that is a part of a non-participatory engagement in democracy, what we like those folk that don't vote. And then there is a complicity with fascism that actually goes along with what the fascist leader and the system is spoon-feeding them, right? Both accounts, in many ways, participate in the emergence and the expansion of a fascist regime. Two ways I want to think about this, right? The traumas that happen to us in a society like this, right? Ida B. Wells Barnett says that somebody must show that the African American race is more sinned against than it is sinned in. Hear that? That we raise these questions, particularly those of us in black churches. We spend time, I've heard it all my life, we spend time demonizing and denigrating certain black people who don't vote, and we make these narratives as if black people at large don't vote, right? When the reality is that we are still one of the highest voting blocs in this country and have been and will continue to be. But the way we often talk about black people, and certain black people particularly, as if they are in some ways a part of the problem because of how they intend or how they approach this democratic system, right? Hear what Ida B. Wells Barnett says again. There's some people who are more sinned against than there are sinned in. Right? How I've started to think about people who opt not to vote is not apathy, it's not political laziness, but what I call democratic grief. That these are folk who are wrestling with an abandonment of how the system promised them life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and at every turn it has failed. To be clear, everything, my mother was first generation in my family to be born with the right to vote in my family. And I don't know if we often think about it that way. But there were promises that were passed down to me to suggest that this democracy works. And the reason why I'm framing this as the American failure of democracy is because there's an assumption that many of us carry in this room, and that is that we actually live in a multiracial democracy. But America has always been a little authoritarian. America has, maybe not totalitarian, but America has always been a little authoritarian. America has always had germs, and in some cases even genes, of fascism. When you think about what this country is, there were 10 generations of race-based slavery. There have only been 6 generations of freedom. We have only been free as black people for 6 generations. We were enslaved longer than we've been free. Right? That is important to know. But we have only been a multiracial democracy for 2 generations. That you cannot really call America a democracy until 1965 when we have the Voting Rights Act. So the concept that we have lived and we have nurtured and we have been a part of some grand democratic project is not real. And part of what we as church, part of what we as followers of the carpenter, followers of Jesus have to reckon with is that fascism is not something, authoritarianism is not something that lives across the pond or lives in some distant memory, but we actually live in a country that has never lived up to its democratic ideals. And if it is a country that has never lived up to its democratic ideals, then it has been inherently authoritarian. It has been susceptible to its own forms of fascist engagement or fascist breeding in some ways, right? Democratic grief is one of the reasons why I think there are generations of Americans, particularly generations of black Americans, who do not engage the political process in ways that we, in polite, respectable political society would want them to engage. But we have not stopped to ask the questions of what about the erosion of civil liberties and the failure of representational government that has dashed the needs and the hopes of the people. Fascism is not about a figure. Fascism is not even simply about policies. It is also about the ways people have been traumatized not to expect more from its government. Democratic grief, democratic grief, democratic grief. An acute feeling of despair and pessimism related to the conditions of public life, governance, and personal well-being that are against the very promises of freedom, human rights, and egalitarian justice that we are promised. How can I say this very clearly? One of my friends, his name is Ronaldo Pearson. He helps me think about democratic grief in some very particular ways because he talks about the 7 deadly sins of democracy. Voter suppression is a part of a fascist arrangement. And we know voter suppression is happening. All we have to do is look at Georgia, where you can't even pass out water on a long line during an election. That's voter suppression. Voter ID laws that don't allow you to use your ID as a college student, even if you go to a state school. Voter erasure. You can be purged from the roll and not even know it because you missed 2 election cycles. And to be clear, not to vote is your democratic right too, that we often don't name. Felony disenfranchisement. Big money in politics. Gerrymandering. Politicians now elect their voters instead of voters electing their politicians. This is fascism. that we have voting systems that we cannot trust. I'm talking about the actual tools for voting that we cannot trust, and an electoral college, which is a vestige of maintaining Southern power at the expense of not giving up slaves. Democratic grief is real. Last thing I'll say, and I'm done now, is there is a pandemic, epidemic, whatever demic we want to call it, of loneliness. Hannah Arendt says that what prepares men for totalitarian domination in a non-totalitarian world is the fact of loneliness. Once it was a borderline experience of those who were on the margins of society and those who were aged, but it's now become an everyday growing mass of time. We see over and over again that there are, I think the last study I saw is that there are roughly 75% of Americans who claim that they experience loneliness at some time of the year. Now, loneliness is not about being by yourself. Loneliness is literally what Hannah Arendt says. It's a break in the relationship with oneself. So how are people able to surrender to the forces of fascism and totalitarianism? Is because there's something in our society that has broken our relationship with ourselves. And if our relationship with ourselves has been broken, it also breaks our relationship with truth. Which is why you can not believe your lying eyes and you can believe a totalitarian or a fascist leader, because there's something in our society that has broken our relationship with the self. If we're going to fight fascism in what we call a democratic society, we have to be willing to try to heal the democratic grief that people are experiencing who live on the underside of white power, male power, and capitalist power. But we have to also do something about the growing pandemic of loneliness that is rupturing people's sense of reality. When I see Trump supporters now, I don't see people who are racist. I see people who are lonely and hopeless and looking for a Superman who gives them answers that fill a void that has happened because they've been broken by the very same capitalism that breaks black people.
As Kirsten prepares to come, I need to correct a mistake I made earlier. I read the wrong set of questions. This panel is, what does participation in the political process, how does participation in the political process intersect with spiritual formation and missiology? Page 7, I was on the wrong line, and you all knew it, and you kept going in the right direction. Thank you. So I needed to correct my mistake, and Kirsten, would you please give us your introductory remarks?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here. As you can probably tell already, I'm something of an outsider. I'm British, so I'm the enemy, or I was a few centuries ago, coming from a very authoritarian regime of monarchy, apparently, although we did chop the king's head off in the 60s and 40s. We had our own revolution, so by the time the US was getting rid of the king, he really didn't have as much power as all that. Anyway, to say that I'm an outsider in that respect, my interests also are mainly in the academy. I'm not ordained. I'm not a pastor, so I'm not intimately connected with the issues that you're facing day to day. But I do hope that my perspective from outside and a global perspective, because my subject is world Christianity, will shed some light on what's going on. Because in a globalized world, what happens here affects the rest of the world, but it's also affected by all sorts of things that are going on outside. So I grew up in Britain, I've been watching America. There's a song about that. I've been watching America most of my life, and we all watch America because we know that if America sneezes, the rest of us will catch a cold. But also because we're curious, can this experiment work? Is there hope in the world for people of different backgrounds, races, ethnicities, cultures? Can they live together? Can they form a nation? And can it be a democratic nation? Some of my earliest memories are from being here in Philadelphia, nearly 60 years ago now. It was 1968, and my parents, who were British, took us to visit the Independence Hall, the Liberty Bell, and we had a great time. There were some plaques outside Independence Hall, that were about famous people who spoke on this spot or something or other, and we stood on them. And as children, I was in 3rd grade, anyway, it made an impression on me in 3rd grade, and I was very curious about the world and opened my eyes to a lot of things. On the way back from that trip, we were driving back to Princeton, New Jersey, which was where my father had a sabbatical at the university. That's why we were here. And my parents took a wrong turn, and we turned into an African-American neighborhood by mistake. And my parents, white British, knowing about the racist things that were happening in the US, although it wasn't very obvious at Princeton, and there weren't any African-Americans in Princeton. My parents were scared, and I was wondering what was going on. But as from the back seat, I could see, as we passed these row houses, that almost every house had a framed picture of the late Dr. Martin Luther King, who'd just been assassinated. It seemed the contrast between those two experiences of liberty and oppression, I think, were quite marked for me. Growing up in that period also was the height of the so-called Cold War. The US was claiming to be democratic and free at home, but of course it was exposed on the issue of race particularly. And also it was supporting right-wing, extreme right-wing, some of them fascist regimes elsewhere in Latin America, in East Asia, and so on, in order to roll back communism. Fascism, we've heard several definitions of already, definitely has to do with nationalism, authoritarianism, and usually is complicit with imperialism, patriarchy, racism. But I want to say that it's not unique to the US. I've already mentioned Europe, and of course Italy is where it started with Mussolini, who wasn't initially a racist, but ended up getting involved with the Holocaust because he formed an alliance with Hitler's Germany. And then you look at Europe today with Putin's Russia, earlier with Stalin's Russia. Actually, although fascism is kind of countering communism, they're very closely related. Many of the fascist leaders were communists. Mussolini himself was a leading communist and then became a fascist. They're forms of extremism, whichever way you look at them. And people with ideals and ideas that they carry out with disregard for human concerns, human rights, and human persons. Not all the definitions that I've read fit those particular circumstances. In fact, none of the places that I've looked at tick all the boxes on that list of 14 points or whatever. It sounds more to me like a description of the contemporary US, but they have a lot of them. Another context that I know fairly well is South Korea. My husband is from South Korea. We met in the UK, and we've also lived in India, and we've been here in the US. And together we wrote a history of Korean Christianity. And one of the ways to describe the Korean story is a story of developmental nationalism. And that could also be applied to Italy and many of these other, Italy particularly. You have a country that has fallen on hard times, can't keep up with the changes in the world, needs to develop, needs to change, and then you have someone who steps in who promises to deliver that change. Well, that happened in South Korea as well. Korea was devastated by its colonization by Japan. It was wiped off the map. It wasn't going to exist unless something changed. It was then faced with the Korean War. My husband was born a couple of years after that finished. It was a dire situation. An egg was a luxury. His mother said, if you see food, you eat it. Lots and lots of US aid coming in, and lots of people ready to work hard and participate in nation building. But how are you going to do that? Well, various experiments were tried with democracy, but in the end, you get powerful leaders, especially because of North Korea, and you can see why they need to be powerful leaders in that situation, with a strong national security doctrine, that everything, the country's not going to exist unless we're ready to fight North Korea again, and unless we ourselves are successful in the wider world. And amazingly, that happened. I mean, South Korea is, and even in the time that we were, the 5 years that I was living there full time in the 1980s to the 1990s, which was the point at which the transition to democracy happened. But just the pace of change, even in those 5 years, and now when I go back, I hardly know where I am because everything looks so different. But this national security doctrine then justified all sorts of awful things: disdain for human rights, imprisoned political activists, including university students and professors, and it also had some other features of the list that we've seen. They co-opted the dominant religion, which had, thanks to church growth, or the church growth was happening at the time, had become evangelical Christianity. So evangelicals worked closely with the governments for nation building, which was great, but even as the governments became more and more oppressive. There was a small group of Christians, the McJunkin theologians, they're called, who campaigned for workers' rights initially, and then civil rights, and more generally human rights. And they were thrown into prison too. So how do we get from there to the democracy that South Korea is today? And in many ways, South Korea is a much more vibrant democracy than the UK or the US, in my experience, at the moment. And there is genuine religious and all sorts of other freedoms. There's a lot of issues as well. How did it end? Well, the government became very corrupt in the 1980s. It was a military dictatorship. That was another aspect of what was going on. But this was at a time of growing democracy worldwide. So the pressures, if you remember if you're old enough to remember the people movements that took place in the 1980s, another one happened in Korea. And in the end, everyone came onto the streets, even the office workers, the middle classes, the intellectuals, everybody was there, and the world was looking at South Korea, what's going to happen. The Olympics were supposed to be there in 1988. Well, they did happen in 1988, we were there. And that was enabled because they said, okay, we'll have free and fair elections. Nobody knew whether they were going to be free and fair, but they were more or less, and things really changed. Whether the US feels such outside pressure at the moment, I don't know, but it really helps. And if the rest of the world gets together and puts pressure, the US does sometimes respond. So that's South Korea. Another example is India, where we lived in the 1990s. We were teaching at a theological seminary as missionaries of the Presbyterian Church of Korea. So we were sent from Korea to India. In 1991, Narendra Modi, who's now the president, was the finance minister. And he changed he liberalized the economy. And since then, India has really grown in terms of a neoliberal capitalist society. And in many ways, that's been so exciting to see. There's so much wealth, so much confidence, unfortunately not evenly distributed. Huge disparities of wealth. But Indians have a new confidence around the world, yeah, great. However, the myth, every country tells their stories. In South Korea, it was, Korea needs to be strong and to be able to overcome its enemies. Well, in India, the nationalism there is more in the way of Hindu nationalism. So in India, India had been ruled by Muslims, the Mughals. Then it was ruled by the British. It hadn't been ruled by Hindus, who were the vast majority of the population, for centuries. And so this idea of Hinduism was cultivated to oppose rule from other places. It was a nationalist thing. It was cultivated in such a way that the majority felt they were a minority, the minority complex of the majority. So the majority feels that they're the ones who are actually the victims. And the enemies are these foreign powers, but also foreigners within, which is anybody who's not connected with Hinduism. Well, primarily the Muslims, they're about 13%. And of course there's Pakistan, and India and Pakistan had wars in the 1970s. I mean, they were one country under the British, and then were partitioned, so the Muslims headed to Pakistan, but there were plenty of Muslims left in India. So there was the enemy, and then with the rise of the Gulf and so on, even more enemies. But also the Christians, of course, who were connected inevitably by Hindus with the colonial power. So it was these foreigners that were coming in with foreign money and trying to convert people out of Hinduism, which was their birth religion. So they were looking to their own resources, to Hindu culture and religion, to build themselves back up. So the BJP, which is Modi's party is supported by high caste Indians. So the caste system then comes back in again in many ways, even though we're in modernity, who despise and separate themselves from the lower castes and the outcasts. And even more by the new rich people that Modi has enabled, not unlike Putin's Russia in that respect. So they keep the middle class happy, but increase discrimination and problems for the poor and for the minorities. India's not a military dictatorship, but they do have the RSS, which is the militant nationalist group, which can do the dirty work of Modi and others. For example, pulling down mosques in order to replace them by temples, and harassing people, especially harassing Muslims and Christians as they go to worship and so on, and encouraging all sorts of restrictions on them. So the RSS are a bit like Hitler's SS or Mussolini's black shirts, and South Korea's military police. So it takes nationalism to extremes. I mean, nationalism can be a really good thing for building up a country, but then, when it becomes the ideology, it sees the good of the nation can only be achieved by beating down everybody else. And there's an urgency to win at all costs because there's an enemy, perhaps a created enemy, perhaps a real enemy, but it's there. So, I'm a missiologist. What's this got to do with mission? Well, first of all, what's it got to do with life? We often hear that church and state are separate, and that means that Christians shouldn't be involved in politics. But everything's political.
Right.
Politics is life, whether it's in Parliament or Congress, or whether it's at a local level. So you just can't maintain that. And the people who say, oh, I don't have anything to do with politics, may be very disingenuous. You look at someone like Billy Graham, for example, and the new evangelical movement was formed at the end of the Second World War for intensely political purposes, to bring evangelicalism back into the centre ground, to get away from the fundamentalist, isolationist kind of image. And so that's intensely, it was an intensely political aim, but denying that church and state had anything to do with each other. Liberation theology taught us that if there's a conflict, you can't be in the middle, because that simply supports the status quo.
Right.
Things are just going to stay the same unless you take a stand. During the colonial period, powerful churches discouraged political activism. It was majority world scholarship that exposed the colonial system, that advocated for post-coloniality, for decoloniality. The issues of colonial issues were raised first by people in the majority world. One of the Indian theologians that I studied for my PhD looked at lots and lots of biblical commentaries. That examined the story of the question of taxes to Caesar. And nobody raised a question then. All these Western colonial commentaries never raised any questions that story meant we have to pay taxes to Caesar. It was only as you get towards the end of the colonial period that people start to question, well, is that actually what Jesus is saying? Mm-hmm. Doesn't the whole earth belong to God? How do we distinguish what is Caesar's? So one of the issues that we have in missiology is, and I think you pointed that out very well in your introduction, Reverend McJunkin, that we don't actually talk about politics. We don't, even for when we're sending missionaries to the far side of the world, we don't expose them to global affairs. Most of the mission training courses and mission education that I've been involved with don't have those topics on the syllabus. So missionaries go all naively into these global situations, knowing nothing of what's going on, knowing nothing of how the US is perceived, and they get co-opted by all sorts of vested interests. So as someone I recently edited the Oxford Handbook of Mission Studies, and definitely made sure that we that we get those topics in there because they are so vital. I think my time is up, and the question also mentions spiritual formation. Since we're going to talk more about that this afternoon, I think what I'm planned for that can wait.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In part, what drives fascism in the world today, its formation and continuation, has to do with migration patterns. And folks who are in the seat of power, who inherited that power perhaps through colonialism, those kinds of practices, now face becoming the minority. That's the case here in the United States. As time goes on, there's different years when we're going to be clear that there's going to be a non-majority nation, and there's plenty of literature out there on the ways that folks are positioning themselves so that the new minority will run the nation. And that has everything to do with fascism. Where I really want to go is to ask you all to respond to the ways that the church, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, have been supportive or worked against fascism. What are some of the theological assumptions? If I were to say doctrine of discovery drove a lot of thinking and behavior in the United States and it came from the church, it was utilized and was a rationale for the near genocide of Native Americans and then slavery. And the church's imprimatur is squarely on it. And some of the literature I read still talks about how the doctrine of discovery is even still used in the courts in making decisions in here in the United States. So the question that I'm getting at is our role as the church. Are we co-opted in fascist movements? Are we doing that today? What are your perspectives on that?
Well, one, I think it's fairly obvious that there are species of American Christianity that has been co-opted, allied by, and party to the authoritarian fascist domination of certain groups in this country, and therefore damned the hopes of ever achieving democracy. I think that's clear. You don't have 246 years of chattel race-based slavery without the theology that sponsors it. That there's a sense you have pulpits, right? And many of them were great evangelical revivalists who were Cotton Mather, Charles Finney. We can name these leaders who were incredible communicators of something that they called the gospel, that allowed a nation to believe that the perpetuation of race-based slavery was in some way a type of social holiness, right? That it was righteous to own slaves. We often people talk about the American dream, and I often remind, well, my ancestors were the American dream. To own black folk was the dream of America. But it wasn't just a dream, it was also a sign that God loved you. This was the theology of the time, right? And my investment in this is, like, I don't want to, like, we can't act as if slavery, human beings living in a country denied the right to live, denied the right to own their own labor, denied the right to marry, denied the right to raise family. Like, these are folk who, there were tax incentives connected to their identity, even when they couldn't even earn wealth, right? Earn any type of wealth. Like, that is a form of authoritarianism. That is a form of domination that in many ways we see now in our prison system. We see, we can run a little. We see now in the way our schools are hyper segregated, and opportunity is hoarded by certain communities, and it is denied in other communities. I don't want to talk about fascism and authoritarianism disconnected from the ways that America has built itself into its own greatness. And it has been the church that has, in many ways, white church that has been a part of it, aspects of white churches that have been a part of allying with this type of system, right? I think it's clear how we name that, but I also think it's clear that we have to make space for the richness of the Brush Harbor tradition. I make the distinction between plantation religion and Brush Harbor spirituality. Right? Plantation religion was that type of Christian, that slave obey your master, that turns into a convict leasing system, that turns into a religion that supports lynching culture, that turns into a religion that supports Jim and Jane Crow, that now is a religion that supports a range of authoritarian and dominating ideologies, but mass incarceration and mass deportation. That we have to be clear that there is a plantation religion that has descendants that is still doing that, right? But then there's also this Brush Harbor spirituality, a type of commitment to Jesus that does not start in a sanctuary, but starts in the clearings, in the woods. That place where Toni Morrison writes in Beloved, where Baby Suggs, the preacher, where she goes out to preach and she's able to say, love your unnoosed neck, right? Love your hands when they're not picking cotton, right? Because no one else will love them over yonder. There's that Brush Harbor tradition that was able to what I say, reclaim the essence of the Jesus movement. Sometimes there have always been pockets of the Jesus movement alive, right? But to some extent, we have to be honest about when Constantine becomes a nominal member of the faith, and the faith becomes the religion of the empire. When the emperor's empanada is put on the religion, it loses some of that indigenous value that I think Jesus was interested in, talking about love, talking about faith, talking about the reign of God, the kingdom of God. But there's something about that allied with power with Constantine that's still alive in the ways that we think about religion today. I was listening to Dr. Kim talk a moment ago about the missionary project. Right? It is the Christian missionary project that underdeveloped Africa. John Henry Clark said that when the missionaries came to Africa to teach the Africans how to pray, the missionaries had the land, the missionaries had the Bible, and the Africans had the land. They taught them how to pray. Close your eyes. When they opened their eyes from praying, the missionaries had the land, and the Africans had the Bible. This is the project, right? This is the project that is alive in the ways church has been a sponsor. Church has been a cover for imperialism, for white supremacy, for patriarchy. We can name it. The question is, are we interested in that Brush Harbor? And I use Brush Harbor spirituality as a symbol for us because, of the work we do here, how we practice faith on these shores. It's that, in my opinion, it's that Brush Harbor spirituality that gives rise to a type of Christianity that can be a resistance to fascism and imperialism. The type of spirituality where my ancestors were able to wake up in the middle of the night when they could have been sleeping. They run off in the middle of the woods and they move outside of the gaze and reach of whiteness, and they start saying things like, I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. They start saying things like, up above my head, I hear music in the air. There must be a God somewhere. And there's a double entendre connected to that, right? Because they are creating songs that feed their spirit, but they're also creating songs that signal what it means to be in resistance to authoritarian Christianity, fascist Christianity during the antebellum period. I think that we have to figure out how do we return to the ethics and the courage and the nature of that Brush Harbor spirituality, whatever it can mean. Harvest that and figure out how we adapt that type of religious and spiritual courage in this current moment that is still a country that exploits labor along the lines of race and gender.
Thank you.
Yes, churches get co-opted, but as you pointed out, so do mission agencies. And there were missionaries and missionaries. Some missionaries came with the colonial power and served the colonial power in many ways, were closely allied with it. There were missionaries who couldn't in William Carey's case, because the colonial power didn't want anything to do with him. He had to set up his mission at Serampore in a Danish colony, but nevertheless ended up working with the colonial power because, well, that's just how it works when you're all foreigners together in another country. So, then there's also the kind of mission movement that is more underground, like the Hush Harbor movement, that's trying to change society, and we see that here even in US evangelicalism. Not all US evangelicals are on the side of the government agenda. I'm trying to work out how in South Korea, for example, the church has got co-opted to this kind of authoritarian type of nationalism. I mean, in the desperate situation after the end of the war, the Korean War, any kind of, everybody was desperate to do something to save the nation, I think, and it was quite right for the churches to also be involved in that agenda. But what happened was that the churches, especially the evangelical churches, seemed to benefit from that agenda, partly because of their connection with the US. That was a great advantage for them. And they liked it. And they started when they started growing, they wanted to keep growing. And they reduced mission to church growth. And as long as the churches were growing, well, that was a great thing. Because they were also contrasting themselves with North Korea. North Korea was making a big show of all these communists in North Korea. They would have big parades on the plaza in North Korea. Well, South Korea mustered 2 million on Yeouido Plaza in Seoul for Billy Graham. So they could, that as the communists grew in North Korea, the Christians were growing in South Korea. It was a kind of, they got caught up into this equal and opposite, this extreme thing. And I guess when you're in it, you don't kind of question it, really. And it was only some people who were connected not with the US, but mostly with Germany, the McJunkin theologians, who began to, had the freedom then to, and the stimulus to ask questions about whether this was the best way to go. But it is a kind of prosperity theology, as you mentioned. And I think also, when the gospel gets co-opted or reduced in that way to making people into Christians and building up numbers of Christians, of course there's also a big democratic agenda behind numbers of Christians. Then you have voting blocks. So, the more Christians you have in South Korea, the more Christians get to say what's going on and so on. once you reduce mission to that, a lot of other things follow. I often observe that kind of religion that preaches and teaches and converts people is usually what men are doing. In traditional societies, the women don't do that. They're not allowed to do that. They're not allowed to preach and teach. So it becomes a very masculine, patriarchal way of doing mission. It's only when you consider holistic mission that you can appreciate women's contribution, which is very often on the sort of social service side of things, building community and family and nurturing the next generation. So it's a distorted missiology as well that goes along with this. But it's also a corruption of the churches. I mean, I could see when we were living in Korea at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, just how much power some of these mega church pastors had. And my husband was a pastor. He did his training while we were in Korea and became a pastor. And being a pastor in those days was really quite a thing. You had great status in the society. The churches were very lavish in the way that they treated the pastors, housed the pastors. Pastors were some of the first people to get cars once the car industry started, and so on. So we did personally quite well out of that situation, and you can see why people like that and want that to continue, and it seems good to them. The churches, in many ways, functioned also to bring people into to train people for living in a modern world. So they were upwardly, if you joined the church, you were generally upwardly socially mobile. So many good things were happening. But the other side, the underside, was being neglected, and nobody was seeing that. The concern for the poor, the compassion for the poor, was not there. The poor were the people who weren't surviving, who weren't prospering, and therefore they didn't fit this corrupted form of the gospel.
As we move toward our talk back time, where you get to ask questions, there's a process by which you can write a question down on an index card on your table, and there's some folks who will be collecting them. Kerwin will be collecting them, and then we'll ask our panelists some questions. While we're doing that, I want to ask the question. It's based on your comments about asking critical questions, the church asking critical questions about how is the gospel being used. Right now, there are political powers that are courting evangelical congregations to get numbers to vote for a particular political party or interest. Are we asking the questions as the church today, across the ways that we divide ourselves, the ways that we think theologically? Are we allowing ourselves to be co-opted? And if so, how are we doing that? What are some examples of the ways that we need to look at the gospel and how it's being communicated? One example would have been an evangelical pastor that was making a comment about one of the candidates running for office and the fact that God often uses flawed people. In Scripture, God uses Moses, and Moses had committed murder. And so when you look and you see politicians doing some things that are not necessarily healthy, that's okay, because God can still use them, so you can still vote with them. That was I saw that on the television on a news show of how a certain evangelical leader was was twisting the gospel in such a way to make people feel comfortable and making choices that were not healthy for themselves, for their own communities. So that's my question to the panel to kind of respond to. What are some of the ways that we need to be thinking more critically about how the church is being manipulated and the gospel is being used to support one political perspective or another?
I could go first this time, a bit more brief, I think, but I think with I mentioned that I grew up in the Cold War, but I didn't know it was the Cold War. Nobody called it the Cold War. Well, they might have done, but it was just the way the world was. So how do you question it when everything is that way? You need someone who's somehow external to it, or somebody who's a victim of it, to be able to raise the questions. And if we're not talking to those people or listening to those people or reading those people, we don't know. So one of the other aspects of that we haven't of right-wing or even left-wing regimes, extreme regimes, is the anti-intellectualism that suppresses that knowledge. And that discourages people from talking to anybody else because they might be communist or something awful. So freeing Christians to be able to engage with others from different backgrounds, connecting with the church worldwide. How did they read the Bible? Well, remembering compassion is something that so many churches globally know about and could easily have seen and did see that evangelicals were not doing, but evangelicals weren't able to hear it, or most weren't. So encouraging people to hear and to be able to critically engage with people, not just to accept whatever they hear, but education, in other words, the best kind of education is so critical to this, and that's how liberation theology started, with emphasizing conscientization and questioning the status quo, asking people to think from what they read in the Bible, how does this relate to my daily life, and reading the whole of the Bible, the Jesus bits as well as the Pauline bits, really makes a difference.
I think that our churches have to ask more existential questions about what's happening in the psychology and in the lives of democratic actors. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the purity of the faith and not about the wholeness of humanity. At some point, we're going to have to decide whether, and I'm not talking about us, but I'm talking about a nation, particularly white America, white Christian America, whether we want to be a Christian nation or whether we want to be a democracy. Because I don't know that we can be both. The way Christianity is practiced in this country, I don't know if we can be both, right? Because white Christian nationalism is about building a nation that is inherently Christian and inherently white, right? The Make America White Again, the Make America Christian Again motifs. These are not just fringe ideas. We literally had a president for 4 years that espoused this on a daily basis. And we have to decide whether we want a democracy that works for everyone or whether we want a nation that is a theocracy. And I don't know that we can have both. That is a question that we're going to have to ask ourselves. And particularly, we need progressive white folk to ask moderate and conservative white folk this question and then lay claim to what's at stake if we don't have a country that works for everyone. As one who is committed to Ubuntu, committed to interdependence, what happens to any one of us in this country impacts all of us in this country, right? And that has to be a part of how churches, white Christians, are framing this with each other. Right? Another thing that I think churches have to do, raise questions about, is when we talk about the spiritual health of people, it has to dovetail with this chronic loneliness that is happening. I have to say this again, because loneliness, and this is the U.S. Surgeon General giving us this information, right? Said that this is the gravest mental health problem in the world, because loneliness leads to heart attacks, it leads to heart deterioration, it leads to dementia. He's given us all these things that loneliness does. And then he says, and loneliness also makes us more anxious, which makes us more conservative, which makes us more easily susceptible to fascist engagement. Our loneliness is impacting how we function as political actors, which I'm assuming also impacts how we practice the ministry of Jesus, right? Or not practice the ministry of Jesus. We need churches that are thinking about mental health on a range of levels, because mental health is personal, but mental health is also political. Not D's and R's. This is not about whether you vote Republican or vote Democratic. This is about whether you vote for justice or whether you vote for injustice. Whether you vote for freedom or whether you vote for domination. And this chronic sense of loneliness is impacting how people are understanding their place in the political world. This politics of resentment, right? Where the majority feels like they are the victims. This politics of resentment is connected to this kind of psychological, spiritual vacuum that needs to be addressed. These are the types of questions. Instead of us being committed to doctrines of don't and being invested in dogmatic spirituality, we have to start treating this gospel the way I think Jesus treated his ministry. It was not to teach us how to be overly spiritual, but to teach us what it meant to be human. To show us the very fabric of what it meant to be the image of God, God image bearers in the world. And if we don't get back to a type of spirituality that is invested in caring for the fullness of what it means to be human, then churches are not asking the critical questions, and it is actually a type of theological malfeasance that has death implications, right? Because bad theology is not victimless. People are dying because of bad theology. Because we're not asking questions that have to do with the right here, right now, if we are focusing on the over yonder sweet by and by.
I have a question, I believe, that came from people online. What are some of the social conditions that make fascism attractive, and how does the church speak to those things? It's kind of close to where you just were, almost opposite in some ways. What are some of the social conditions that make fascism attractive, and how does the church speak to those things?
Well, I pointed to the need to develop the nation. When the nation appears to be, or actually is, going downhill, people don't feel as if they're prospering, or they're attacked by an enemy. So developmental nationalism. So when you feel that America needs to be made great again, that is one of the things that's it's an expression of what we're talking about, and so that kind of and it often happens to nations who feel that they have a great past as well, that they need to recover. I mean, you could say that in the Korean case. Koreans are proud of having a history of 5,000 years. They had printing before Europe, all sorts of examinations, 2,000 years ago. No wonder they're so good at it today. Wanting to recover some glory days of some sort, and that's why in Europe, this is perennially attractive as well. You know, Italy with Mussolini, you could call on the great days of the Romans and so on. Some British would love to get back, you know, Great Britain. It's that kind of motivation is, at least at a political level, is a very much part of it, I think.
I would only add to that, the mythological interpretation of America as a Christian nation helps to do that. This sense that God cares more about what happens to America and Americans than God cares about the rest of the world. And maybe they read John 3:16, for God so loved America that he gave his only begotten son, right? That's what's underneath this.
Nationalism, yeah.
I mean, the theology of American exceptionalism is a theology that says that God loves America and Jesus is American. There's something there. That's a social condition that makes fascism in this country possible. Wealth inequality makes fascism possible. The majority of those folk who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were not people anywhere near their leader's tax bracket. Working class white folk who say they love Jesus. That's the profile of police loving, or as they were killing police loving folk. That's the profile. But it is true that they felt an economic scarcity, and the way they interpreted it as, well, and they use this language, all the Mexicans are taking our jobs, right? You know they use the blanket when they talk about Latinx folks. It's the Mexicans are taking our jobs, right? And the black folk are stealing from the government with all that welfare. Right? This is the way they have been taught to make sense of why they are losing economically. Because since Du Bois, Du Bois has been saying, if we can get the laboring white class and the laboring black class to understand that they have one common opponent, then we can actually topple the problem of racial capitalism. But fascism feeds on this kind of competition at the social bottom, right? And so the social bottom of white folk see a savior in a fascist leader. And so we can't talk about this without also talking about economic inequality that is rampant across our country.
Thank you. Got some more questions?
Yeah, probably ask this one and then give him a break before the next thing.
Okay. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Today is the National Day of Prayer. What are your thoughts about the protests of college campuses and the violence that is occurring? Ooh, that's a big question. Okay.
Give it to us one more time.
All right, I can't do all of this, so I'm going to go with y'all want to go to campus? Yeah. All right, there's a move afoot to go for discussion about campuses as a just. What's the justice issue that's going on that's being lifted up at campuses? Is that okay? What is that protest all about? How does that relate to this topic? Okay.
Well, I mean, it's related to this topic because we've not figured out as Americans how to full-throatedly say terrorism is wrong, but so is also colonial occupation. We have to be able to say both of those at the same time. Otherwise, we will never have any peace in that region of, although it's a complicated narrative, right? I get that, right? It is tough when you have folk who are willing to die to eradicate another people group, right? That's tough. Like, the terrorism that exists there needs to be condemned, and in some ways it needs to be solved. I don't have an answer for how we fully get rid of the threat of a Hamas. I don't know that answer. I know that it can't continue to fester if life is going to happen. But I have to also say that colonial occupation and military engagement, the way it has functioned, is also problematic. The terrorism and the genocide are both wars on the image of God. And that is why those college students are ablaze on those campuses. Now, I would love for it to be only nonviolent engagement. I think it largely is nonviolent engagement. I mean, the same thing that they do to the Black Lives Matter movement. You have a few rogue defectors who come in and cause problems. Now the whole movement is violent, right? That is not what's happening on these college campuses, right? And so they work together because we have to be honest about what Netanyahu is doing and honest about what Hamas is doing, and be clear that all those bombs that are dropping are American bombs. That's right. You are paying for those bombs. We are complicit in genocide, right? And we're also complicit in terrorism because we don't know how to talk about both at the same time. And so we need those uprisings. Now, my hope is that they sustain this type of nonviolent engagement on these campuses. Because from what I understand, that when those college movements started in the 60s, we didn't get an end to that war until the 70s, right? To Vietnam until the 70s. It could take 5 years of protest every single day to get it done. The question is, does Gen Z have that kind of stamina, given the ways that we've been programmed to expect things immediately with this? That is going to be the challenge of how we help sustain this nonviolent movement across the long haul, because justice never comes on the express path.
Thank you. Want to take a crack at it?
Just to add that the question of violence is also pretty central to this issue of extremism, fascism, and whatever we're calling it. And it also, of course, is relevant to the left as well. And so the anti-fascists, the Antifa, are blamed for all sorts of violence, and there's some, and people can believe that because of previous experience. So where do we cross the line between peaceful protest and violence? That's a huge debate, and I know that the civil rights movement and African Black Lives Matter and so on have done a lot of rationalization, a lot of reflection and thinking about that. Just another situation that we haven't talked about is South Africa. Mm-hmm. And someone who studied that situation talks about how I should be able to quote Mandela on this, but I can't, but wrote about him that he understood that if your aim is still to keep one nation, you're going to have to live with each other at the end of this struggle.
Sure.
Yeah. And so the way that you go about your protest and your struggle has to have reconciliation as its aim, and therefore it has to be done in a way that is reconciliatory.
Sure.
The more the violence, the greater the disruption, the more the lives that are harmed, the much harder it is ever to, and you could say this in the case of Israel and Palestine at the moment, that you're breeding up resentment for generations to come.
Sure.
How can that reconciliation happen? So we who follow Christ, who is the reconciler, and if our mission is reconciliation, then we have to, the end and the means have to be compatible. We can't use any means to get to the end result of reconciliation. They have to be means that are compatible with the gospel, with the good news.
That was good. You all handled that very well. Thank you so much. Your group, your small group talked about. That would be helpful. This is the feedback time. Okay? So, as folks are coming in, let's get started with the feedback so that, because we've got 5 different groups. Let's hear a little bit about what you were sharing. Is there a volunteer from one of the groups to come up and be the first person to talk about, to characterize your conversation? Come on up, Suzanne. Reverend Dr. Suzanne.
I figured I'd get this out the way.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. I represent group number 4. Yay, group number 4. Woo! Anyway, what we talked about, and looking at pages 4 and 5 of your booklets. That's right, turn right there. What we looked at is congregations not having the framework to be able to name what they're experiencing. Is that we pray for our congregants, we talk to them about different things, but then we leave them without the words or the concepts to be able to say, this is what is going on with my life, and these are the things that are harming me. And so we leave them without the framework, which means we leave them without solutions or a pathway to resolution or healing. And so what we felt was important is we need to have conversations with our congregants. Also, our preaching and teaching must be in line with helping them to deal with the things that they are experiencing in life. That knowing that going hungry, being unemployed, and the different things that they experience in their lives are not just isolated instances, but there's part of the systematic things that are going on in the world. And I think that, anything else, group, that I need to add? They're silent.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Group 4. Another group want to give us feedback? Thank you.
Hi, group 5, where are you? Woo-hoo! Woo-hoo! Oh, I got 1. All right. 2, couple, 3. So I didn't take notes because I didn't know I needed to. But I would say 3 things, and if you all want to add to it, you can. I would say that when we looked at the first question, one of the things we felt people were experiencing was disconnect in a number of ways. Disconnect from the traditional, whatever that is for you, church. Disconnect from the issues, thinking maybe that that's not their issue, or this isn't going to affect me, or I sure hope it's not. Or disconnect in terms of sort of giving up, I've given up thinking that I can impact this in any way, that I can make a difference, or that my church will be able to make a difference. We also talked about the courage to educate and to preach. To step out of traditional boundaries, whatever those are for your and our communities, and to say, it is my role as the preacher to educate and impassion. We use the word passion and being passionaries. I know that's an ABHMS word. But so talking about how we can help people get to where we think they need to be. And we can do that from the pulpit. And the last part was we talked about Christian formation being a lifelong learning opportunity. And we need to do that in our congregations. We can take the lead in that, but we also need it for ourselves. And part of that Christian formation are things like, and our spiritual formation includes, as clergy, spiritual direction, ourselves being accompanied and refilled as we are challenging others to do the same.
Thank you. Very good. Let me hear from another group. Yes.
Group one.
All right.
Group one. I have to try to read my notes. It says building bridges. One of the things that we've learned is that when people don't agree with you, in order to quote unquote keep the peace, we tend to stay quiet. So when our friends and our family or church members are on another side, just to keep the peace, we decide to stay quiet. A lot of older folk, especially black older folk, are worried about the recurrence of Jim Crow and slavery. And then we realize that Gen Z or younger generations have expressed a hopelessness that what's happening now is just going to be the same no matter what I do. And so how do we balance that? How do we figure that out? Also, we talked about the power of sharing your story. We had someone share their story of what that made them feel less than human. And yet when they shared that story with others, the people related. And even people who were on the other side, who were on the opposite side of the aisle or on the opposite side of where they believed, came together because of the power of story.
Thank you. Do you see Rebecca Irwin-Deal out there? Okay. That's okay. If she's not right there handy, that's okay. I was going to try to get some feedback from one of the online communities, and Rebecca did one and Janet did the other. But if Rebecca's back in her office, then I'm not going to trouble her. I don't know what's going on, but we'll let that go. So, are we ready? Has the oh, one more. I'm sorry. Thank you for pointing that out to me.
Hello, everyone. In our group, Group 3, we dealt with the
Hold the microphone. Please.
millennials and the Gen Zs. There is some people do have the younger people in their congregation. I'm not one of them, but we are to be consistent in our behavior because people are always watching us as Christians. Even though they do not attend church, they're looking at us all the time. So we have to be consistent in our behavior, our actions, and our attitude toward others. Engage the relevant issues. And our silence is complicit with what is going on. So as a group of people spreading the gospel, we have to always speak out and not just sit down and let things happen. Jesus' manifesto is the template, and that's what we should be using when we are trying to engage people. One person, and this, we don't want to hear this on the news, say burn them down, burn them down. You know who that was.
We know who that was. Is there someone online that wants to share? Do you have an online person that wants to share what happened to their group?
Hi there. Can you see me?
Yeah, okay, there's Rebecca. All right.
I'm in my office, but just want to share what one of our groups online talked about when we asked the question, what are believers struggling with, and how, what assistance they need from clergy. One of our group described some of the biblical teaching that he's been doing to kind of focus on what the Pharisees taught and how that's kind of a cautionary tale about what the people do not need from the clergy, is bad theology. We focused a lot on kingdom ethics and Jesus' example and focusing on those teachings as something that could unify the church and bring us together. We talked about a need for conflict mediation and transformation and safe, sacred spaces where we can disagree and ask questions and listen and critique without feeling like we're being attacked or opposed. And one person in particular highlighted that we need to position ourselves more as learners than leaders. And that's one of the ways we can lead is by modeling, asking more questions and doing more listening than offering the right answers and doing all of the talking, she said as she spoke at length.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to move into the second panel. So I'll ask Kirsten and Willie if they would please come up. And I'll try to set up where we're going. You might want to work on the mics while I'm talking, micing them. And then y'all can pin those on yourself. If there's an underlying concept for this next panel and this afternoon, it would be for those of you all who are online, there's a piano in here that has an automatic feature to it, and it's playing some beautiful music. And so we got to figure out how to turn it off. All right. What a wonderful segue. So when I talk about the derivation of meaning, I want to know, meaning that's Fowler's word for what the process of faith or faithing is. And as I looked up this notion of political formation, or more correctly, political socialization, it was amazing to me that the idea of synthetic conventional faith in the stages of faith, and how one turns to peer groups, to trusted leaders, to institutions, in order to be able to say, well, this is meaning, this is how I should live, this is how I should behave, this is how I should live, as opposed to an internalized kind of expression. It's very similar with the political socialization process, where most people, most adults, learn about political perspectives through family, through peer groups, through trusted institutions and leaders, and not necessarily doing the internal work where they're saying, this is what I own, this is what I think, this is where I come out. Rather, I don't want to get outside of my comfort zone by going against the community in which I'm a part. And so if my party or my particular political ideology group says this is the way I should be going, that's what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to necessarily question it, because then that brings about a certain kind of conflict, internal struggle. And so the question becomes, what has spiritual formation got to do with that? How is it that our belief in Christ, our relationship with God and our relationship with each other, that process, how does that impact how we think about our politics? How does the love of Christ, you all been talking about that this morning, how does that inform the way I look at my politics, the way that I engage the world So that's one of the things that we're going to talk about in this session. We're also looking at emotional health of the parishioner. What are they going through in this political climate? There are differing experiences. Some folks in this particular climate might experience shame, lament. How do I deal with this? I can see that this is not fair, and how do I deal with the fact that I need to make an adjustment in my own life and the way that I respond and the way that I learn to care about other people. There's others who would have what's called racial trauma. As fascism rhetoric is shared and there's an in-group, out-group. Those who have historically been on the out-group or who are dominated by the majority culture can go through a re-traumatization. My mother gave me a perfect example. This in one of our conversations very early on. She's like, I thought we struggled with that already. I thought we had marched against that. I thought we had completed this struggle. Why are we going back into this again? That gives you some example of what I'm talking about. I wonder sometimes, because I'm not part of the Latino community, when you hear all this stuff about folks from Mexico and South America and threatening to put people in camps and taking away children and separating children from their parents, some of us it's an intellectual conversations, and for others it's very much heartfelt. And it comes with a lot of fear. That's traumatizing. And so you, as clergy people, need to be thinking about, how does my work interact with different folk? If I think about Generation Z, somebody said, the younger generations, and how they can feel isolated and their perspectives are not heard and not shared by the majority of the members of the congregation. How do you deal with that? How do you develop forums to have an intergenerational conversation around the political climate that we find ourselves in? Are we being intentional about that? That's kind of where we're going in this panel discussion. Also, what about your preaching and your teaching? How are you going to structure that? Those events as you march through August, September, October. Thinking in your head, where am I going? What am I teaching? What sermon series might I want to develop? Again, this is for you as practitioners who are going to go back and touch the lives of people, whether it's as a chaplain or a pastor or a church leader, a group leader in your, how are you going to do that? Hearing everything you said today, what kind of forums do you want to develop? Be thinking about that. So that's what's going on in this panel discussion. How do you help people to do the self-reflection, the political critique, and how do they use the spiritual disciplines? What are our traditional spiritual disciplines got to do with helping people? Meditation might be one. We had that exercise this morning about breathing, right? And centering, and how can that help me as I'm going through what is a traumatizing experience? What is prayer? How is my prayer life intersect with this? So you can be thinking about, well, what are we doing with prayer meetings? And does it have anything to do with the stuff that people have going on in their lives and in their minds, the stresses that they're going through, and how might I use these kinds of forums. So this, we're switching now. This morning we talked about the concept, the reality of what fascism is, where it comes from, how it operates. And once again, you have those definitions in your book. Please go back. That's why we put them in there, so you can go back and take a look at that. You have a hard copy. And while I'm at it, Jill also, there's a bibliography in here that Dr. Jill Bradway put in there. And also on your table, there's a tent with the QR code. That's the word I was trying to come up with, okay, that you can use so that you can get this big, thick resource packet that's been designed with additional information and tools for you to use. So you want to make sure you get that. That's our way of providing you some additional tools, so when you go back home, you got tools that you need to help you get your ministries done. Okay? So I'm going to switch. Now, I think I'll stay the same way. So I'm going to let the doctor go first. Both of y'all are doctors. Since you're the preacher and pastor, I'm going to ask you if you would.
Yes, sir. Whatever you tell me.
Would you please to help us get into this business about, as spiritual leaders, how might we prepare ourselves for the work ahead?
Sure. All right. So when I think about the spiritual foundations of how we survive this moment, I am very clear that we are all very taxed, we're all tired, and many of us are fighting for survival. And this is important because it's one aspect, and the way I approached this section was, we, for a living, have a responsibility to, or we feel a sense of responsibility to be partners in other people's spiritual formation around them. And what I have learned in my journey as a pastor, as an activist, as a scholar, is that sometimes that comes at the expense of my own spiritual formation and growth. And there's something about the work that we shoulder that is literally impossible as leaders of faith, as practitioners of leadership in the faith community. And so I open that by saying that whatever these spiritual practices are that we would love to lead our congregations through, that they have to in some way start with us and by us, because it is not possible to lead people to a place we've not gone ourselves. And I say that as somebody who has lost a lot, right? Not lost people, but in this game, in this work of political engagement and democratic protection and expansion, is what you'll find out is that you lose in the fight much more than you win. For whatever reason, evil seems to be well-funded and well-rested, and it never takes a day off, right? And these are things that we have to contend with, right? This is why spirituality is so important for how we do this work, because there is, I said this earlier about the Gen Z generation, is that it takes a type of stamina and it takes a resilience that is hard fought and is formed and is not natural. Because when you are fighting for people who are poor, when you're fighting for people who live under the threat of patriarchal domination and the like, when you live in a society and you're fighting for those who are trapped in the cog of racial capitalism, you will lose more than you win. And that is important to name out loud. And it's important to name out loud because some of us have nurtured a spirituality that is solely about winning. A spirituality that is this prosperity gospel that Dr. Kim was talking about. This prosperity gospel has duped us into believing that enough faith and enough passion does the entire work. But the reality is that our ancestors who lived under that tyranny of chattel slavery took 246 years for it to give way. And what does it mean to maintain fight against fascism when you know it doesn't die easily? To maintain stamina and energy under fascism when you understand that even when it dies, it knows how to shapeshift and resurrect. So that's how I enter this conversation, right? That's how I enter this conversation. Because what is spirituality? What is spirituality supposed to do at its core? For me, I understand that, or the type of spirituality that I want to be engaged in, the type of spirituality that I want to practice, is one that helps to do the work what Paulo Freire says. It helps to conscientize. That word conscientize, it literally just means to raise the consciousness of those who are most impacted by whatever the form of domination is, right? The spirituality ought to wake us up to what's actually happening to us. Remember a moment ago, I talked about how I believe that those who are susceptible to fascism, even when they look like they're the acolytes of the fascists, they too are carrying wounds that are so deep, they're carrying traumas that are deeper than any of us can probably assess at its core. And what spirituality ought to do, at least in part, is to wake us up to the drama that is actually assaulting us. Spirituality ought to wake us up, and then it ought to reposition our gaze. One of my colleagues at New York Theological Seminary talks about spirituality as consciousness, and I think that's pretty common across the ways people think about it. But I am interested in after an abolitionist spirituality. I think I talked about that. I won't go into it now, but I think I talked about that when you all were in Puerto Rico. That the type of spirituality that is necessary in this moment is an abolitionist spirituality. It is a spirituality that is invested in the here and now, a spirituality that is trying to build a type of resolve that knows how to absorb the blows of the world. A type of spirituality that wakes us up so that we can dream of a world that we've never seen before. One of the things that I hope to continue to develop is a spirituality that feeds my imagination. So much of what we do in church is memorization. So much of what we do in church is regurgitation, recitation. A lot of what we do when we come into that space is ritualization of what has been passed down to us. And that is fine to a great degree, that we must always find those linchpins between what was and where we are today. But how much of our spirituality is also allowing us to use different parts of our brain that is not simply based on reading what has happened, but is now giving us an opportunity to dream a world we've never seen before. Now that may sound really simple, but most of us do not function with imagination. To dream of a world, this is why we say we can never have a world without prisons, because we don't have enough imagination. This is why we tell ourselves racism will never go away, because we don't have enough imagination. An abolitionist imagination allows us to believe in a world we've never seen before, in spite of the only world that we've ever known. A world that is organized by, structured by, and rooted in all of these isms that give way to fascism. We need a spirituality that allows us to use different neural energy to see what we've never seen before as possible today. So an abolitionist spirituality for me is something that Michel Foucault talks about, and that is a political spirituality. In the book, in Silencing White Noise, I wrote, the political without the spiritual is predatory and loveless, and the spiritual without the political is passive and unproductive. A political spirituality allows us, according to Foucault, it allows us to unsettle and disrupt the regimes of knowledge that make us. Because part of how we see ourselves is based on the structures and the regimes of knowledge that tell us how to see ourselves, that tell us who we are, that tell us what's possible in our world, that tell us what we can have and what we cannot have. It is so easy for us to surrender to the structures of knowledge that exist today. A political spirituality is invested in our souls, but is also invested in our bodies. Maybe this is why Dr. King says that any religion that claims to be concerned about the souls of people, but not interested in the social conditions that strangle those souls, is dry as dust religion. It is merit-bound religion, because the kind of spirituality that we have to engage, whether it is based in prayer, whether it is based in meditation, whether it's based in a range of other things, it has to have some sort of investment in the lived experiences of people. And to some extent, this is a radical departure of how we often think about spirituality. I draw us again to Black church, right? There are a lot of us in here who would probably say we're members of the Black church. Raphael Warnock talks about the divided mind of the Black church. That the Black church grows in an attempt to fight for freedom, but one does it through privatistic piety and the other through prophetic resistance, prophetic protest, right? But this kind of spirituality has to be able to do both. It has to be able to nourish the immaterial parts of who we are, giving us capacity for imagination, but it must also have a serious concern and serious implications on what happens to the body. I had a student, forgive the phrase I'm getting ready to use, I had a student at Memphis Theological Seminary. He was a Kojic bishop, and this Kojic, much more conservative than we are probably. He said that his uncle refused to go to his church because he was trying to get his uncle saved. And his uncle said, my soul is already saved. I want to know who's going to save my ass. So a Kojic bishop said to me, excuse the language, right? A Kojic bishop said this to me. Because a part of our spirituality work has to be about how are we saving the actual bodies of people. I'm going to say a couple of practices and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kim, right? But that's the kind of framing of how I understand spirituality. That make sense? Lamentation is paramount for how we save ourselves in this moment. For whatever reason, we don't cultivate the spiritual discipline of lamentation. I need us to hear that right now. One of my professors always said, lamentation is really backhanded praise. It's backhanded praise because even as we are talking about what's wrong in the world, if we do it in a framework where we're talking to God, it still becomes an act of faith. That lamentation is not complaining about the way the world is, it is truth-telling about the way the world is. It is a venting of a guttural core about what the world is. But even to name that the world is a mess is also to say that we have expectations that the world can be better. So on one hand, lamentation is a type of critique, but a backhanded way, lamentation is also an affirmation that we know the world is not the way it should be. That we have to give people in this political cycle, no matter what happens in November, we have to give people sacred and safe and brave space to cry out. brave space to lament, right? That even if your sermon ends in celebration, it still can be born out of lament. That maybe one of the reasons why the America has not been the America that it was promised to be is because we have forgotten how to lament the crisis that we're living in now. It is how I often thought, the normalization of the insanity of injustice, that we no longer cry when we see death. How is it that we go from hashtag to hashtag of people being killed by police and we don't shed tears? How is it that we can easily walk past people who are probably just as brilliant as we are, just as faithful as we are, but are living in tent cities because of what policy has done to them, and we don't lament? How is it that we can see people come through our food lines and come through our charity engagement without us having anything within us that wants to cry out about what's happened? That to engage the work of lament as ministers and as congregations is to reignite the sensitivity of what it means to be human. We've been desensitized by the massive assaults on our bodies and on our communities that we can literally run from tragedy to tragedy and it does not impact us. Lamentation allows us to cry out. I keep saying that, to cry out, to cry out, to cry out, because that was a part of the genius of the spirituals. That was a part of the genius of the Brush Harbor spirituality, is that the intentions were to get out of the gaze of domination in order to yell, because there's something, I don't know how it works, but according to the science, there is a restructuring, a shifting, and a healing of the brain when we have the capacity to yell with freedom, to cry out with freedom. But instead, we police people in church to worship and to function with domesticated forms of praise instead of allowing people the radical cathartic release that they actually need. The types of hell that our folk are catching on the job, they need a place where they can cry out without being judged, without being ridiculed. There's this African lament. There's this African tradition. It's a Kenyan tradition called Jayo. This is the belief. That when you yell out of a sense of mourning, when you yell out of a sense of grief, God, or the gods, but God meets you in the yelling. Now, for years, I heard people say God inhabits the praises of God's people. Yeah. But I've never heard anybody tell me that God inhabits my mourning, my wailing, and my weeping. Yeah. What would it mean if we shepherded people, allowing them to believe that it is through yelling that God also manifests in their lives? We have to grieve what has happened, not just grieve. We have to wail, we have to weep, we have to lament what is happening to this country and not believe that there is nothing normal about children going to school and being taught 2 grade levels beneath the grade they're in. There should be nothing normal about black folk warehousing black in prisons when the people who bankrupt Main Street on Wall Street almost 2 decades ago got to go scot-free. There should be nothing normal about people storming the Capitol and the insurrectionist in chief gets to be on the ballot in every state that he wants to be on. That we have to be clear that there's nothing normal about that and be willing to wail, mourn, and cry out about that. How do we create a culture of mourning that allows us to reclaim our sensitivity and reclaim our humanity in a world that has done nothing but try to break our humanity? Fasting. And I'm not talking about, but it is a spiritual practice, fasting, pushing the plate back. That we fast from social media now. We fast from certain foods when we practice the Daniel fast or we're in the middle of Lent. But what if we actually saw boycotts as a type of fast? Wow. Did y'all hear me? Jim Crow didn't break in the South simply because people marched on the street. What made Montgomery effective is for 380 plus days, they didn't put any money into the bus system. They spent over a year walking to work, walking to the laundromat, walking to church, walking their children down the street. It was a divestment from a system that did not honor their dignity, did not honor their humanity. How do we begin to re-engage the practice of boycott as an act of fasting? Is what I'm trying to see if we are capable of doing. And why is this important? Because in 1956, the buses in Montgomery had lost so much revenue that if the black churches in Montgomery had pooled their money together, they could have bought the bus company. According to Virgil Wood, who was a part of that bus boycott movement, right? Because we have to be able to see, I'm making a larger point about how do we see the work of justice that we do as a spiritual practice itself. That boycotting is not just economic divestment, and it is that, and maybe the only way we get the attention of those who are the captains of industry and the custodians of capitalism is if we learn how to disrupt the only language that they really care about, and that's money. But to see boycott as a type of fasting, maybe it is not a boycott, but when Jesus goes into the temple and tears over tables, he stops the operations of the temple for that day. That Jesus doesn't just run people out and then he leaves. Literally, they cannot collect any more money from poor people on that day. That obviously disrupts the temple economics for that day. That is the kind of spiritual reading of boycotting that we have to think about if we want to see the change that we want to see. And then the last thing I would say here is spiritual Christian education. Learning is a part of our spiritual discipline arsenal. And one of the questions that I ask folks, and generally when I'm at the Progressive National Baptist Convention or I'm at the National Baptist Convention, this is probably more apropos to them than it is to us. But how is it that we're still okay allowing our Sunday school rooms to be evangelical theology in blackface? One of the concerns that we ought to be clear about is that white evangelicalism doesn't just live in white churches. Franklin Graham is not the only one spewing white evangelical theology onto black bodies. There are several, if not a plethora, of black churches that are governed and preached to by black people that are receiving white evangelical poison and white evangelical toxicity because we've not done the work to actually interrogate our theology. Because even some of the liberal seminaries we went to were still based in colonial thought and imperialist thought and chattel thought. One of the tools that we have to use as leaders is we're going to have to interrogate and we're going to have to figure out how we purge our theologies and our doctrines from the whiteness and the patriarchy that we have been fed. Because, and I'm not saying the doctrines themselves are problematic, but there are some implications to the doctrines that we have to give attention to. What is your theological North Star? And your theological North Star has to be deeper than what Paul said. I'm going to quit because I know I'm going to get in trouble right here. But it's very interesting to me that we are more Paulian than we are Christian. That we have our members recite Paul, read Paul, memorize Paul, what Paul said about Jesus, but we never actually have them memorize what Jesus taught himself. How many of us can quote more than one parable? How many of us have the Sermon on the Mount memorized the way we have Psalms memorized? That if we're really going to do this work of liberation and soul nourishing, how about we actually ground it in the very man's teaching that we say we follow? Because to be a disciple of Jesus doesn't mean you know his biography, where he grew up, who he was raised by, how he was born, and how he died. If we don't know the teachings of Jesus, then we are nothing more than people who know a little bit of his biography. I probably know about Jay-Z's biography more than I know about Jesus' biography. Knowing someone's biography does not make you a disciple of that person. How do we reconstruct a theology that is actually grounded in, when I was young, what we call the letters in red? Because when we don't do that, we find ourselves allowing an Americanized white Jesus to become the savior of a nation, when the reality is what we need to do is crucify that Americanized white Jesus and leave him in the grave. Stop getting that Jesus up on Sunday. Stop resurrecting that Jesus. Not y'all, I'm talking about what the church needs to do at large. We have to figure out at this moment, if our theologies are going to be liberative, we have to figure out how, the same way we celebrate Jesus saved us from the penalty of sin, we're going to have to save Jesus from the penalty of America. Otherwise, we're all going to continue to live in hell as America goes to hell.
Yeah, I feel I'm going to pause for a moment to take all that in. Yeah. So I read this question as about spirituality and formation, and also about discernment. I've written about mission as spirituality, or a spirituality, in the sense of how we do mission. Spirituality teaches us how we do it, the way that we do it, how we carry ourselves, our posture, and as well as the kind of religious things that we do around mission. And mission and discipleship are integrated. If you look at the most obvious mission verse, Matthew 28, it's all about disciples and making disciples and doing so in the context of the whole world. You can't, get a clearer statement of how mission and discipleship are together. So we can't do mission without also being good disciples. If we're disciples, we will be engaged in God's mission, which is a global as well as a local matter. And then when it comes to discernment, there are well-known people who've written about discernment. Ignatius of Loyola, for example, Jonathan Edwards, Richard Foster, I think, was mentioned. I've tried to do my own take on this, which I will share with you. But I think that one of the main things is that the discernment process is not, or should not be, reduced to self-reflection, which is what we sometimes do with Ignatius and Jonathan Edwards and Richard Foster. The self-reflection is absolutely important, but that self-reflection is supposed to help us in our calling to live in the world and to bring about the change, or participate in the change that God's making in the world. But we do need to start with the self-reflection and root out the causes within us that affect our spirituality, and especially when it comes to extremism, fascism, and the issues that we've been talking about. We probably need to ask ourselves first how we treat other people, whether people are more important to us than ideas, or whether the ideas are, and I'm afraid this is failing of mine that the ideas are so exciting. You know, I'm not so bothered about the students. How do we treat other people? And also, there are questions given that we've mentioned patriarchy in this context. How do we treat our family, wife and children in that case, although women can also be authoritarian? Do we have a hierarchy of people in our hearts? Do we kind of rank people according to their culture, their religion, their wealth, their race? Do we like strong leaders? Do we want to be strong leaders? And you know there's a sense in which all leaders need to be strong, but in the strong man sense. We could ask others what they think of our leadership, and if we're authoritarian, they perhaps wouldn't dare tell us. Do we blame others for things rather than taking responsibility? I think these are all related to the kind of issues that we've been talking about. Do we want to be popular? Do we tend to gather like-minded people? Or are we willing to be challenged by the people we associate with? Are we easily flattered and puffed up when people say nice things? Do we stand up to bullies? Have we got that kind of courage? Or are we, in fact, bullies ourselves? Sometimes. And do we want to win at all costs? That's a very difficult question, and it also relates to the reconciliation issue that I mentioned at the end of the last session. I had a conversation with Sharon. I can't see where Sharon. With Sharon. Who pointed out quite rightly, and I've also heard this from the South African context, that we don't jump too quickly to reconciliation. There has to be a process, there has to be truth-telling and everything else. But also, what I heard from Sharon and would like to share is that reconciliation doesn't always depend on us. There are situations when if oppressed people, like the people of Gaza, can't begin a reconciliation process at the moment. It has to be from the other side. We can't reconcile when we're being attacked or when we're not even invited to the table to talk. And I'm reminded of the words of St. Paul, who we probably quote too much, but who says that live at peace with others as far as it depends on you. So we can make that offer of reconciliation, we can live in a peaceful way, but what the other person chooses to do may make that very challenging and difficult to do. So spiritual disciplines also are about discernment of what's going on in the world. You always heard, the Bible on the one hand and the newspaper on the other. Spiritual discernment is not only spiritual doesn't mean it's a spiritual activity only, but it's about discerning the spirits. What are the spirits, the gods, the powers, the forces, the influences that we're up against? What are the things that would like to control the way that we act and behave? How do we discern those? Where are they coming from? And until we've done that, we're not able to actually address them. So some of this comes out of my work on the Holy Spirit, pneumatology, which I learnt mainly in Asia from studying Indian theologians and Korean theologians, who talked about a mission spirituality, which means that kind of activity of discernment, not only in my heart, not only in the church, but in the wider world. And that means that discernment is not always negative. There are good spirits around as well that we need to discern. Angels are ministering spirits, we don't always see them. So the first thing about discernment is it starts, I argue, with affirming. With affirming, appreciating the world that God has made and the people, the good people that God has made. Appreciation of the diversity of this world. Understanding that people who are very different from us may nevertheless speak the truth. And we need to be open to hear that. Building intercultural understanding. Assuming the best of others. Not thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. And being slow to judge others. So I think as Christians, that is the way that we are formed. I hope, and I believe that's scriptural and biblical, to receive people and ideas. And Jesus himself, I think we can see doing that, being prepared to talk to all sorts of people and listen to all sorts of people. So then, on the basis of that affirming posture, we are able to discern. You can find more about this in my book, The Holy Spirit in the World, A Global Conversation. Discerning where is the Holy Spirit at work then? What is the Spirit of God doing in this? And how are we going to see that in this kind of social and political context? Well, you might think, well, where's the Holy Spirit at work? Well, in the church, obviously. Well, yes. And in light of our conversation, no. There are many people who say, Lord, Lord, said Jesus, and don't do what I tell them. So we need to discern even within the church who is for the gospel and who's against it. Another criterion for discernment that's often used in the literature is Christ-likeness. Where we see Christ-likeness, there the Holy Spirit is at work. And this doesn't necessarily mean that these people are Christian. They may be behaving in a much more Christian way and Christ-like way than many of the people who claim to be Christian. Wow. Isn't the Holy Spirit at work there also? If the Holy Spirit's only at work in the church, how does anyone ever become a Christian? The Spirit must be at work wider in the world. That's, my bottom line with evangelical audiences is that. They have to accept that much. But can we have a wider understanding of how the Holy Spirit is involved in the very creation itself, and is part of us, and our makeup is breathed into us and into all human beings before we even get to Pentecost. And then so there was the church, Christ-likeness, gifts. Are people being lifted up? Are people being gifted by whatever activity this is? Or are they actually being exploited? Are they being empowered, but in a loving and constructive way? And so that's come through especially from the Pentecostal movement in the last few, Pentecostal theologians in the last few decades. And then another thing that's happened in the last few decades is liberation theology, of course. Are people being set free? Are people being freed? Are they being liberated by this activity? Or is somebody else getting the benefit? Is somebody else being built up at their expense? And or is, actually, are they being imprisoned with some sort of violence? So anyway, I put those criteria out there to World Council of Churches mission, the Mission on World Mission Evangelism Conference back in 2004 and 2005. They've been around and discussed. So hopefully they may be helpful here. So when we thought about affirming and discerning, then in terms of political critique, which was in the question, and political action, that means, I think, that we go, we have our political lens, or we're alert to politics being out there in all sorts of different circumstances. And we have a hermeneutic of suspicion. If we apply these criteria, who's benefiting from this? Where is the money going? Where is it coming from? We don't want to be hypercritical on the one hand. We don't want to be belligerent, kind of warmongering, stirring things up. That's not Christ-like either. But there is a sense in which we need to be against things, but not in the sense of being negative about things. We also have to stand for something. And a lot of what we observe at the moment is all the negatives, the criticism, the blaming. Well, what's the alternative? What are you going to do instead? What is the new world that is being imagined here? Or is there one? There are lots of different ways to change the world. I'm particularly involved in academic formation. I'm in charge of the PhD Intercultural Studies at Fuller. I tell my PhD students that this is a different way of changing the world. Many of them are activists, and they continue to be activists, but they've decided to take a long view and a longer-term approach, and they also have to subject themselves to the discipline of academia. That means that they can make their arguments, but they have to do so in ways that are credible in the academic world, otherwise they won't be heard in the academic world, and they can't change the way people think. But nevertheless, if you succeed in changing the way people think, you don't always change their actions, but you could change a lot of things, and you have a platform from which to change a lot of things. So education, not anti-intellectualism. Education, not extremism, either left or right. You can't make a credible case simply by rhetoric. You have to do the research, you have to weigh the discourses, you have to be critical and not jump to conclusions, but you can say a lot at the end of the day. And then when it comes to actual action, it's again in relation to mission, what is the kind of action that we're called to take? I remember a quote from David Bosch, who was a member of the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, a famous missiologist, and partly famous because he stood up to the Dutch Reformed Church against apartheid. And he pointed out that in the South African context, it was at that time under apartheid. You have right-wing government allied with religion. It's really easy to preach the gospel. Nobody was going to stop you preaching. Well, they might have an issue with your content, but preaching and calling people to conversion and so on, that wasn't a problem. That aspect of mission was taken care of. What was much harder to do was to reach across the apartheid divides. To intermarry, for example, to work with people and to work to dismantle apartheid. And you can see the same thing with the evangelicals versus the McJunkin in Korea. The McJunkin certainly took the harder side of mission. In those circumstances, of course, there are circumstances in which you can't preach the gospel, and so trying to do so is an important missional activity. and perhaps the gospel that you're preaching may be rather different from what is normally preached. That's also a courageous thing to do. But in thinking about, the quote from David Bosch made me think, well, what is the regime trying to make me do? What corners am I being boxed into if I'm not careful? And that might give me a clue as to what I actually should be doing. So maybe if there's nationalism is the main thing, maybe it should be internationalism. If there's authoritarianism, maybe we need to be demonstrating other ways of relating to people and of making decisions. If it's patriarchy, affirming the equality of women, the ministry of women. If it's imperialism, well, what's our vision of the world order and how do we get there? If it's racism, well, I think probably there are many people here who know better than me on that. But I would like to leave with one final thought, which is one of my attempts to address, my humble attempts to address racism, is through the discipline of world Christianity. And world Christianity is a fairly new discipline, but it's gained a lot of traction in the last few years as an alternative expression of missiology, if you like. But it's the study of Christianity as it is in different parts of the world, and how we learn from each other and how we can engage from each other as Christians. And one of the chief motivations for doing that in a post-colonial era is to de-center the West. How do we de-center the West? How do we de-center whiteness? Yes. Well, we can do that through world Christianity and by seeing ourselves as part of this world church that God has brought into being in every continent amongst almost all people, and seeing ourselves as part of that. All Christians are baptized into the whole church, not just into a local church, not just into a national church. Right. We as Christians globally should be in solidarity with one another, should be supporting one another, should be hearing one another, and trying to understand one another. So we should also support our international organizations. I mentioned the World Council of Churches. There's also the Lausanne movement later this year, and mission agencies and so on that exist to try and connect up the world and demonstrate our interconnectedness in Christ.
Thank you, both of you, very much. I want to go after one issue I don't think I've heard hit the table that's important. One of the characteristics of fascism is rampant sexism. The governments of fascist nations tend to be almost exclusively male-dominated. Under fascist regimes, traditional gender roles are made more rigid. Opposition to abortion is high, as is homophobia and anti-gay legislation in national policy. How will that impact what you teach, what you preach, what you lift up in the life of your congregation, what you see going on in the United States right now? It brings to my mind all the arguments and fervor over transgender issues currently, and kind of stoking anger and suspicion and divisiveness, anti-gay stuff issues, concerns right now highlighted in order to polarize people. And the question becomes, how does the church address that? I'm not of the assumption that we all agree on where we come out. Not at all. But we need to be conscious that this can be a tool that is used to inflame and to polarize. So I'm not sure that issue hit the table, but I didn't want us to get out of here without it. So panelists, could you help me kind of search through that? Any takers?
Read two US women authors' recent books, Beth Allison Barr, with 2 R's, who explodes the idea that Christianity is essentially patriarchal. Forgotten the title, but The Myth of Biblical Womanhood. So she deconstructs the complementarian arguments. She's a medievalist and shows that how women in the medieval period were engaged in all sorts of things in society and religion in a way, anyway, a very powerful way. And then Christine Cobes de Metz, who talks about the cowboy image of evangelicalism. That Jesus and John Wayne is the name of the book. Again, a well-informed academic woman, but writing in a popular, accessible style, and again addressing issues of complementarianism. So complementarianism polarizes the genders. One of the big issues in East Asia is yin-yang, male, female, or female, male actually, where you have the genders are associated with all sorts of other aspects of life. So male is sun, woman is moon, light, dark, hot, cold, all these things, every aspect of cosmology is related to gender. Now, of course, you could take that to mean that, they are interwoven and you have this wonderful unity, which is most often how I find it explained in Christian theology books. And drawn upon. But my experience of that in Korea was actually that it's polarizing. And that, there are all sorts of proverbs and ways of talking about the other gender that play on these things. So husband is high as heaven, wife is low as earth. Husband takes care of the big things, wife takes care of the small things. All those kind of stereotypes. And we have those, of course, in the West, not quite as clearly stated philosophically, perhaps, although there's quite a lot of it, of misogyny in philosophy and even theology. But yeah, that's what we're up against. So in pursuing gender justice, we are actually helping to undermine and dismantle some of the other things that we've been talking around, racism and rampant nationalism and so on. Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
It is a resource I would recommend is Brandon Crowley's Queering the Black Church. And Dr. Crowley is attempting to disrupt the sort of binary that we think about in terms of sin, not sin, the binary of gay, straight, and really approaching and trying to figure a larger humanity that should be the project of our spirituality. But he's also doing a critique on the heteronormativity that is fundamental to how we talk, appoint, lead, and engage on the local church level all the way up to the denominational level. So Brandon Crowley's Queering the Black Church would be a resource to help think about queerness as an opportunity of interpretation and an opportunity or the development of a lens that disrupts whiteness and the like. So I say that. And then I also think it's important for us to think about queerness and to think about sexuality at large. Because the ways that sexuality has been defined for us and confined for us is also a product of white sexual ethics as an attempt to control how people, particularly men, how white men want other people to view bodies, what they can do with their bodies, what they can't do with their bodies, all the while white men are doing what they want to do with slave bodies. And we can never, and this is Kelly Brown Douglas, it's not me, it's Kelly Brown Douglas, is making very clear that you cannot detangle the ways that white Christianity talks about sex and sexuality from how white men own, police, exploited, and violated bodies. Male bodies, black male bodies, white poor male bodies, white women's bodies, and definitely black women's bodies. Greater than the transatlantic slave trade was actually the exploitation of the black woman's womb. That is what was used to produce the most slaves on this country. And so we can't talk about a sexual ethic and the Bible that was preached by white male Christians without also talking about what white slave-holding Christian men did to build a nation on the bodies of black women. That's how I'm trying to draw this connection to us. That to be able to subversively and sacredly engage the question of queerness invites us to have a more robust conversation about sexuality itself. I am always interested in how church folk don't want to talk about money and they don't want to talk about sex, but they want both of more. They want more of both. Right? Come on, y'all know I'm telling the truth here. Right? But there's a politic, right? There's a politic at work that makes us uncomfortable talking about bodies and talking about what bodies need and the sacredness of bodies. And I think that is also a part of the fascist project, is to turn bodies into things. That's what capitalism does. It is so totalizing, it turns all bodies into commodities. What can it earn? What can it produce? What can it do for me? What can it grow? What can it build? Right? That we've turned bodies into tools. We've turned bodies into means instead of ends within themselves. Right? And so I think your question invites us to say, how can we lean into actually talking about the sacredness of all flesh? And to honor the fact that bodies have needs, that bodies need to be fed, bodies need to be clothed, bodies have other types of needs, and to be able to say that because it is engineered in the makeup of what it means to be human, and humans are created in the image of God, so those needs in some way ought to be seen as manifestations of holiness too. Maybe this is why Aubrey Hendricks pushes us to think about treating the needs of people as if they are holy. Because unless we're able to talk about human bodies as sacred, to be real about human bodies being created in the image of God, we say it, but do we really mean it? Because if we really mean that human bodies are sacred, womanist theology is able to say that black women's bodies are sites of theological activity. To be able to say that God is black, to be able to say God is a woman, right? It's to name, in addition to saying God identifies with the oppressed, it's to also say that God sees sacredness in humanity. What else can we make of the fact that in our Christian main narrative, God becomes a human being? Human beings have to be worth something if God becomes one. How do we reclaim our bodies and to see them as holy? No matter how small they are, thin they are, big they are, no matter how much weight they carry, what the lip shapes are, the hair courses are, no matter what those bodies desire, can they be sacred because they are bodies? And when we can say bodies are sacred because they are bodies, then we don't have a hierarchy of human life. The reason why we have these we have these hierarchies of human value and hierarchies of human life is because we actually haven't accepted the fact that all bodies are God's bodies. Whether they are abled in the sense that we traditionally think about it, or they're differently abled or disabled, but these are God's bodies. The Holy Spirit, this being the temple of the Holy Ghost, has nothing to do with whether or not it has all 10 fingers in both arms. It has nothing to do about whether it has a vagina or whether it has a penis. Those things matter too. I think they do, because particularity is important, right? And it's important to name that those particulars are also sacred, but to also say, no, it's a body. And because it's a body, God affirms it. Because it's a body, God loves it. And to be able to say that may give us an opportunity to disrupt the kind of fascist impulse that tells us that it's okay to put certain bodies in cages because they weren't born here. And it's okay to tell certain bodies what they can't do in consultation with a doctor because they're not a man. And to tell certain bodies that they can't go to this college because they are of a certain skin color, right? To say this body is not eligible to have this job because of blah, 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 blah. We ought to get to the point where we're able to say what God said at the beginning. He saw bodies in Genesis and said it's good. Very good. Well,
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And children,
Go ahead.
nationalist, developmental nationalist regimes, fascist regimes, they need a population. They want to increase the population, and in order for their development purposes and for their power purposes. So, that should be the main job of women. I remember a very long time ago, I spent a summer as a teenager in Germany with my pen friend, and we went to visit her grandmother, and her grandmother disappeared into the cupboard for a moment and came back with a small box. She opened it up and proudly showed me her medal from Adolf Hitler. The German mother, which was awarded to her because she had 5 children. She gave birth to 5 children. Yeah, well, that's fascism, I'm afraid.
Can I also say, there's something you said earlier, Dr. Kim, when you were talking about nation building, developing nationalist regimes.
Developmentalist national development. Yeah, something like that.
Yes, it's also, it made me think about when we were talking about what is happening in Gaza. And to talk about that is really even a larger cautionary tale. Because the gravest threat to all of our lives right now is climate change. No matter what we call it. The planet is not sustaining itself because we are doing everything we can not to help it sustain itself, right? And that's a very important question. And I just keep wondering, we're talking about the bodies, the preciousness of women's bodies, but in some environmentalist thought, the earth is a body, right? And the things that we continue to do to the earth is also an indication that we don't really care about what's natural. We don't really care about nature. The fact that we're destroying our planet. And it made me think that people are fighting over land that actually belongs to God. I mean, the biblical interpretation is the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Right? We're fighting over land, which this idea, we need a people, we need a land, is a part of the fascist makeup, is also an assault and an affront to God, because none of this land belongs to us. And this is what indigenous people really understood well, particularly indigenous Americans, indigenous Africans, and we can run the list of indigenous communities who understood that the earth belonged to itself, or it belonged to God. And that is also a breakdown, because sometimes I wonder if nation building itself has been the greatest threat to this planet. That we're able to say, this is my land, these are my borders, we deserve this, you don't deserve this. And then what we do to it, the act of building nations may be an affront to who God is. And I know that there's a whole story in the Old Testament about the people becoming a nation, a chosen nation. But the more we see how nation states have performed and how they have been violently territorial, the ways that nations have poisoned the very nations that they claim they love, the land they claim they love, it makes me raise the question, is nation building itself an affront to God? And is it one of the gravest threats to this planet, the only home that we have that we're losing at a very rapid pace?
I think it depends on whose nation and relative to you. I mean, if it was my nation that was being suffering genocide or something, I think I would probably feel that nation building was right and proper, and that I would be justified in that. The problem, there's some turning point between a country wanting to establish itself and security for its people, and provision for its people, which are all, I mean, if you're a national leader, those are all good things to be thinking about, I think. And the turning point comes when the nation then starts to think that because it has achieved this, it is somehow superior to other nations, or because it had this experience in the past, this glory in the past that it, other nations are trying to diminish it, and it needs to reassert itself. So it's the supremacy aspect of nationalism, and they do often go together, as you've pointed out, that becomes a problem, I think. And that how at what point you turn from one to the other, I think is quite difficult to discern.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still struck biblically by the truth that biblical Israel is created at the expense of innocent Canaanites.
Well, there is a response to George Tinker that says that Tinker overstated that if you read the Old Testament text carefully, they did make agreements with the Canaanites and so on. But yes, that's often how it's used. So we haven't actually talked this was another issue that Sharon raised with me. We haven't talked much about Israel, and we haven't talked about millennialism either. So in this nation-building activity, often because there's a perceived external threat, the urgency is there. This nation-building has to happen quickly, and therefore it can be at the expense of other people because the goal justifies the means. And then, of course, when you think about the nation of Israel, there's all sorts of other things that have the contemporary nation of Israel, the way it's been linked to biblical stories and to a revelation and so on, has complicated a lot of things, and the alliance between Christian, right-wing Christians who supported the Zionist project and Jewish Zionists, although don't think the Christians have the interests of Jews in mind,
Sure.
Has created, we can see what's happening today, and the uncritical support of Israel it's so difficult to say anything against it because of that kind of divine right that's been given to it.
Sure.
And I don't want to speak against Israel, but as people are demonstrating at the moment, there are certain things that need to be said, and just anti-Semitic.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say, wow, and how blessed I am by the panel. And Kirsten, you said the goal, G-O-A-L, justifies the means. But at first I heard gold, G-O-L-D,
I'm sorry.
justifies the means.
Similar, we didn't talk much
The
about the
gold
money either.
justifies the means. I mean, which is at the heart of our argument. that this conquest that has been demonstrated, is being demonstrated all across the globe, is often driven by greed and people trying to own nation, the world, the globe. So I'm gonna take a question. You got a question for me? Did you all have a question? This is the talk back time. No questions? Okay, yes, sir.
So I just heard you talk about the earth, and I'm thinking of it from a stewardship standpoint. That God put us here to be stewards of the earth. What we've done is try to become gods of the earth. And because of that, we're doing whatever we can and how we can. I was amazed that we had an earthquake here, and over on the West Coast, they expect to have earthquakes all the time. But to have one here, so the earth is kind of rejecting what we're doing, flooding, tornadoes in places. And what it's going to do is move people from where they are to somewhere else, because there are going to be places that are uninhabitable. And so
Yeah.
it affects where we're going to be in the future and people, how people connect with one another. But they'll move from the south to
Okay.
the north.
All right. So so the question.
So the question is how the impact of those people moving from or migrating from those areas to our areas.
Yeah. If I'm hearing you, and I'm trying to think of several things simultaneously, but I was trying to listen. Migration patterns. We talked about that. Has everything to do with driving the development of fascist regimes in the world today, whether it's because of war. You can think about Ukraine and the number of folks who've left and where they moved. You can think about Brexit, the shifts in population. In the United States, the migration from South America up, and it's not just South America, they come up through Mexico, and there's really more global than that. But population shifts have a lot to do with the phenomenon that we're seeing around the globe. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, and when there's an influx of new people, those long tenured communities tend to tense up. Which is also a part of a fascist impulse. I mean, we got once black people are free from slavery, the white people who claim ownership to the land in order to live with those black people now create black codes and then create Jim Crow policies, right? Black folk move from the south to the north, from the south to the west, and the other migration patterns. And they're black folk who are already living there saying, man, we don't want them here, right?
Yeah.
Because the influx of migrants creates tension for people who are already there. And that's the piece that we have to learn to solve in terms of anchoring our humanity and this radical embrace of different, because difference is not just different skin color. We can name difference about anything. There's some, as a man born in the South, for most of my life, I probably had more in common with a white boy from Texas or Louisiana than I did a black boy in New York City, right? Now, we probably experienced racism, but in terms of cultural connections, I had strong cultural, the patois, the way we use language, phrases, what we ate. were very similar with the white boy that lived down the street. That's different than what some black boy that lived in Harlem understood. That we have to learn how to see just how afraid this country makes us of difference, because difference is not just skin color, it's regional. We can run the list. And so, to your point about how the earth is going to continue to make migration happen differently, that we have to figure out how to cultivate a broad-heartedness and a sense of egalitarianness, that we are ready to welcome the difference, because it's going to happen whether we like it or not.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to take this question. How do you reconcile your theory of nationalism with the fact that national liberation has been a critical means Okay, I can understand it now. I just trying to read it and think and talk at the same time is not working for me. Okay? We'll try it one more time. How do you reconcile your theory of nationalism with the fact that national liberation has been a critical means of liberation for the oppressed, as it was for the Hebrew Israelites?
And by Hebrew Israelites, we're talking about the biblical characters. And I'm assuming we're talking about the critique of nationalism itself. Well, let me say it this way, and this is not wholly revealing of how I feel, but I want to say that all nationalism isn't created equally. There's a form of nationalism, and I'm suspicious of all nationalism, unfortunately, based on my experiences here as a black man. But there's one sense of nationalism that is about using one's power, resources, and culture to destroy something indigenous, or to create new forms of domination, and types of nationalism that are overthrowing those types of forces. Right? I see those as different from each other. One is a tool of liberation, and again, this doesn't wholly represent how I feel, but in this moment, one represents a type of liberation and an overthrow of colonial occupation, and the other is the imposition of colonial occupation. And I wouldn't want to put those two alongside each other. I make space for what Malcolm said could be possible, for what Elijah Muhammad said could be possible, if necessary. That if black and white people could not coexist because of the ongoing deaths of black folk, if they wanted to give us Detroit and Atlanta and they would stay out of those places, okay, if that's gonna keep us alive, okay, let's talk about it, right? So that kind of nationalism is very different than the kind of war-centered, exploitative, extractionist form of nationalism that gave birth to this country. I think those are pretty different. If the various groups of indigenous Americans decided to unify and overthrow the white settlers who came here, I think that's a different form of nationalism than the kind of nationalism that came here and took what belonged to other people. And there are texts of terror in the Bible. I gotta be honest, there are texts of terror in the Bible. Joshua has many of those narratives, the way they're told, the way I read them. These are texts of terror. And I have grave questions about what happens post-wilderness life. The way it is sacralized, the way the violence is sort of breathed upon as okay and normal. Some of those normative, dominant readings of how the children of Israel in the Bible become a nation, they ought to cause us some levels of concern. To do certain things to women and children and say God told you to do this, it ought to raise some concerns. Right? What happens on the other side of that Jordan? We have to grapple with it. We have to wrestle with it so we don't repeat it.
And could I just
Kirsten, go ahead.
mention that the story of Israel has also been an inspiration not only for US nationalism and for people coming across the Atlantic to from Europe to the Promised Land, but it was also in the Korean context when Koreans were introduced to the Old Testament and heard the story of Israel and how Israel lost its nation and was petitioning Jesus for the restoration of the nation. How Israel lost its nation before and got in the Old Testament as well got restored. All those stories, they were going through the process in the early 19th century, 1905 to 1910, of losing their national identity to Japan. They absolutely empathized with the story of Israel and pleaded with God to restore the kingdom, which was a long and protracted struggle and was in the end made possible by the end of World War II by the destruction of Japan. All sorts of peoples have been inspired by that story, and it's that, where does that kind of nationalism tip over into something else when we want to save our population at the expense of everybody else's, when we actually want to destroy other, we get into genocide and all sorts of other things. But part of the problem with nationalism is that it's created in the modern world differently from how the nations are understood in the Bible. So nations in the Bible means peoples.
Sure.
As a response to the Reformation, we ended up with the creation of nation states in Europe, so that peoples had to be in particular territory. All the Catholics would be under a certain Catholic king, and the Protestants would be under a Protestant king, and so on. So nation and state, and all the apparatus of state went together. If we can try to dismantle some of that, that might actually help the relationships with people. One big example of that is the Northern Irish situation, where you have Protestants and Catholics at each other's throats, terrorist attacks from both sides. I grew up in England. I never crossed the Irish Sea until quite relatively recently, because it just wasn't seen to be safe to go to Northern Ireland or even Éire. But in that situation, what enabled the peace, the Good Friday Peace Accord, had a lot to do not with internal factors, but with external ones, with global ones, or at least with European ones, in that both Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and the UK joined the European Union at the same time. So they were partners in the European Union. Borders were coming down across the European Union. So what's this anomaly of Northern Ireland? How does that fit? And the peace in Northern Ireland was able to be restored because a lot of the tension then was taken out of the relationships in the British Isles. So sometimes the way to solve the problems locally is to create peace in the wider world. The Germans knew this at the end of the Second World War. They were divided. They built up their nation and then generously gave lots of money to all sorts of peace-building nations in the rest of the world, and eventually, and to the European project, and eventually they were able to be reunited. Koreans have tried the same thing, not with the same success, but initiating global relationships, hosting global conferences, engaging in all sorts of global bodies to try and bring about the reconciliation that they are looking for.
Okay, thank you. Good question and response. And now we move to the heart of the matter, so to speak. Because the heart of the matter is what you will take with you to prepare for the work ahead in your location. this is where you're going to be called to synthesize all you've heard, the ideas, the concepts, this input has been so rich. Now, what do I do with that? How does this prepare me to go home? As I say, I got to go back home and I've got to do ministry. And so you're going to talk among yourselves about, well, this is what comes to mind for me. This is my starting place. These are some forums I think I might want to develop. These are some educational forums that I think I might like to do. This really triggered a sermon series for me, or this really caused me to think X, Y, or Z. That way to come to talk to you about evaluation and as also receiving information from you. And then Reverend Kerwin Webb is going to come up and represent ABHMS and talk to you a bit about that. And then Julia's going to give us the prayer, and we'll be underway. I want to say to the steering committee how much I appreciate you. I want to say to the Reverend Dr. Kimberly Johnson, Kimberly's been here all day, and she's the Dean of Palmer Theological Seminary, and I am just delighted to experience that kind of partnership that she's brought to this event, bringing her expertise, energy, and commitment. To the Ministers' Council and to the Philadelphia. There's members of the Board of Directors for the Philadelphia Baptist Association. Would you raise your hand if you're still in the room? It's not every region that would engage this topic, but I didn't have any pushback. The Board of Directors was like, yeah, let's go for it. So we appreciate that. So with that said, I'll reluctantly give up the microphone and ask Jill, she'll come, followed by Kerwin and then Julia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today and for staying to contribute to this important conversation. We hope that your appetite was whetted to get more. And so what we are hoping that you'll do is to download the resource book, and to look for an opportunity, because one of the things that we've heard is that you would like to continue this conversation. And so we're not exactly sure what that's going to look like, but we have all of your information, and we will most definitely be in contact. Another thing is that we will be sending you an email that contains a link to complete an evaluation, and we just ask that you would do that for us. It is also a physical form in the back of your program, so you could either take the paper form there, or you can complete the link that will be coming to you by email. Thank you again for being here and for your contribution in ideas today. Thank you.
The facilitators are going to be sending in the responses, so the ideas that you all had, the kind of forms you're going to set up, the concerns that you have, we will collect that and we'll send it to you, okay? And my last word is to thank Janet Reedy.
Yes.
Thank you for coming out. Thank you for engaging, and thank you for dealing with this real and important topic that is a challenge to our collective nation. What I would like to offer is that the American Baptist Home Mission Societies, like I said earlier, looks to partner with individuals and organizations that are doing important work. This conversation, there's so much that we have not been able to dig into, and so prayerfully we will not end with this being today, but there will be other opportunities for us to engage and talk. One thing that we are doing is we're developing a cohort-based class through the Center for Continuous Learning entitled Political Discipleship. There's a resource that comes from the Center for Public Justice that teaches Christian citizens about their roles in engaging in politics, but also it walks through, it's like a Bible study that walks you through the process of identifying an issue, building the support with the individuals that are in your community, and then it ends up with you contacting an elected official to present your problem, challenge, idea to that person. Once we've developed this course, we'll send out the information to PBA and they can send it out to you, because we would want for as many of you to join as possible. The curriculum helps you to learn the steps so that you can take it back to your communities, to your churches, and help engage other people. Because if Christian citizens don't speak up, don't activate, don't engage, then the way that things are going will be the way that we continue to go. And I don't think that we can really afford that. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Hopefully this is not the last time you will visit us at this place. And our prayer is that we will change the world and better reflect Christ in this world. Thank you.
Amen. And I forgot to thank Dr. Kim and Dr. Francois. Let's just give them
Let us pray. O faithful God, we thank you for the borders that were stretched in our hearts and our minds today through Dr. Kim and Dr. Francois. We thank you for the plowing up of our hearts and minds because of their insight and their passion that they shared with us. We thank you for the seeds that have now been planted in our hearts towards change, for justice and equity, for love, because love conquers it all anyway, anyhow, all the time. And we look forward to how you will germinate those seeds, nurture those seeds, and bring them forth into fruits that will change not only us and our perspective on the world, but the world itself, even the cosmos. Because we know, Lord, it's expanding. Because you are an infinite God, there are no borders where we cannot reach out to and make change for you. So we thank you, Lord, and that word from Paul, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, nor entered into the heart of any of us, what you have prepared, because you love us and we love you. Through Jesus Christ we pray.